Hey guys, you are watching your anime world. How are you all? Please support to subscribe this channel for watching new interesting stories. So in this video, we will see second part, what if Deku unlocked the power of Myriad. Here is short summary. When Izuku receives One for All 2 weeks early, he doesn't expect it to knock him out. He especially doesn't expect it to awaken something that had been waiting in his very soul for that moment. Now he has much more than just One for All at his disposal. But before we start, if you want more stuff like this, then be sure to subscribe and like this video. And if possible, share this video with your friends. Now let's start the story. As school ended the next day, most of the students of the first-year heroics course gathered outside of the school gate, waiting for the transportation that Yaoyorozu said she'd arranged to take them to her home. The only ones out of either class to decline the invitation had been Bakugo and Todoroki. Izuku had known that Bakugo was a lost cause, and would likely be disruptive anyway, but he did ask Todoroki why he didn't want to join. Todoroki had stated that he did not feel that martial arts would be of too much help to him. Izuku had respectfully disagreed but hadn't pushed it, especially as something told him that there was more to Todoroki's refusal than he was saying. While the students chatted as they waited, Izuku asked to speak with Kendo and Ojiro, his two fellow martial artists moving off to the side with him. Yes, Midoriya-kun, the tailed boy asked. Considering how many of our classmates are coming to this lesson, I was wondering if you two would mind being my teaching assistants, he said. Kendo nodded thoughtfully. I can see why you'd need some help considering there are 37 of us here. Yeah, it would be hard to give attention to such a large group, especially since, from what you said to Mineta, you'll be teaching different styles to different people, so you can't just lead them all in the same katas. Ojiro said in agreement. Anything specific you had in mind? I figured we could start by us three sparring with each other, so we can each get an idea of the other's skill, and to give the others a practical demonstration. Then you guys could lead whoever I'm not focusing on at first through some basic stretches and movements while I give some individual attention. Ojiro and Kendo nodded. Sounds like a good initial plan. The blonde boy admitted. I would worry about how you're going to keep such a large group focused, but after your display during lunch yesterday I don't think that'll be an issue, Kendo said with a small smile on her face. Before anything more could be said, they were distracted when a very large and luxurious-looking bus, the kind that ferried music stars around while touring, stopped in front of the gate, the doors opening for them. More than one person was gaping slightly at the thought that this was the transportation that Yaoyorozu had arranged. They'd been expecting a generic bus of the like that schools rented for special events. Not this. I knew she was well off, but damn, Izuku murmured as the students began to board the bus at Yaoyorozu's urging. He patted Yuru Araka's shoulder, the girl seeming dazed at how much just this must have cost. The students were amazed at the opulent interior of the bus, which included snacks and refreshments that Yaoyorozu assured everyone they were free to enjoy. In spite of the luxury, it was still rather cramped, but that was to be expected when there were almost 40 teens occupying it. A couple of the students seemed to be annoyed by how much this display seemed to be designed to smack them in the face with how rich 1A's vice representative was, but when any of them saw her happy bounciness at getting to have everyone along and share, even the most off-put swallowed whatever they were going to say. Everybody's minds were further blown when they reached the ponytailed girl's house, which was actually a mansion of nearly absurd size, especially when one considered how high real estate prices in urban Japan could be. Uraraka wasn't the only one that appeared to be shocked into catatonia. Yaoyorozu then proceeded to lead them to the expansive dojo, which Izuku, Kendo and Ojiro were significantly impressed by. Once everybody had changed into their workout clothes in the attached changing rooms, the lesson began. Izuku stood in front of the large class of sitting teens with Kendo and Ojiro standing at his sides and slightly in front. Tightening the belt of the gi he was wearing, he focused on slipping into the teaching mindset he'd developed during his life as Ranma. Peter could also teach combat, but it was more general than structured. Ranma might be somewhat eccentric in his teaching methods, though nowhere near his father's level, but he got results. Of course, he would be giving the teaching style a slight Izuku spin so it'll fit his current personality and students better. Thank you all for taking a chance on being trained by me, he began. his voice confident yet friendly. Before anything else, I want to assure you that you're not making any sort of commitment, and I'm not expecting any compensation for this. The entire point is so we can all help each other grow and improve as heroes in training. If, after today's lesson, you don't feel this is a good fit for you, that's fine. He eyed the gathered teens to see if any of them would comment, but they were all simply watching him intently. Alright, first, we're going to start with some sparring between me, Kendo-san and Ojiro-san, so you can have an idea of what we can do and what I might be able to teach you. He turned to his prospective teaching assistants. Kendo-san, Ojiro-san, are you ready? The two turned to him and nodded before glancing at each other. Ladies first, the tailed boy offered. Before Kendo could respond, Izuku spoke. Actually, I was thinking that you could both face me together, using your quirks to their fullest. He said as he turned to begin walking to one end of the sparring area. His two assistants turned to stare at him, not seeming pleased at being apparently dismissed in such a way. Among the students, Monoma was the one to voice the opinion of quite a few of them. That seems rather arrogant of you, he said, a slight sneer in his voice, though he kept it mostly under control at the moment, so Izuku didn't find any reason to crack down on it yet. I have no doubt that they're both very skilled, Izuku said simply, but, to be frank, I need to establish my credentials with them and you all if I want to be listened to. If they beat me, if they utterly trounce me, then that's great, and I'll appropriately eat crow, but I'm going to take the gamble for the sake of making things easier down the line with all of you. He turned from Monoma, who looked begrudgingly understanding at that, and turned to his fellow martial artists. So, once again, the two assistants glanced at each other before Ojiro nodded and Kendo huffed lightly. Fine, but don't complain when we beat you, she said as she took one of the more advanced karate stances, Ojiro doing the same beside her, both eyeing Izuku warily. Were this Saotome Ranma facing them, he would have taken his customary non-stance, both to not reveal anything and to aggravate his opponents. Izuku, however, didn't want to cause any issues by appearing to dismiss their abilities out of hand and instead took up a basic anything-goes stance before gesturing for them to attack him. There was a moment of stillness before Ojiro moved, his tail hitting the polished wooden floor of the sparring area to launch him forward into a flying kick, Kendo following behind in a dash, ready to attack as well. Izuku flowed around Ojiro's attack with ease, gently tapping the boy's outstretched leg in just the right place to unbalance him upon landing, the movement flowing into a dodge of a punch by Kendo, the fist missing his face by millimeters before he lightly redirected her momentum even as the fist suddenly expanded with shocking force. Even when he was forcefully suppressing his spider sense to make this a somewhat fair fight, he was able to react in time, tilting his head enough that her enlarging fist only ruffled his hair. Then, before Ojiro had even landed, he was behind her, a palm strike landing between her shoulder blades to force her forward and off balance, making her almost stumble into a similarly unbalanced Ojiro. His two opponents spun to find Izuku's bare feet sliding backwards along the hardwood as he got a bit of space again, his green eyes calmly assessing them, prepared for anything they might do. Kendo and Ojiro shared another look, this time looking more wary, before they began to approach Izuku a bit more carefully, obviously taking this more seriously. For the next 5 minutes the other members of the first-year heroics course watched as Izuku seemed to lead the obviously skilled teens around by the nose, dodging every attack with ease and usually only redirecting their attacks, only going for proper strikes when they left obvious openings, the speed and strength of each attack almost shocking each time it came. Even the least talented amongst the audience could tell that Kendo and Ojiro were skilled, but Izuku made them look like children flailing around in mock fights on the playground. During his time before the beginning of classes, Izuku had trained his fighting skills extensively, both in spars with All Might and on his own. Ranma had been a grandmaster by the time he was 20 and had only gotten better from there, never seeming to truly plateau, but he'd known both of his bodies intimately, to a level few could reach. That meant that Izuku had to relearn everything so it would work with his new body type and superhuman capabilities. His efforts had paid off, as he considered himself to now be about 80% as skilled as he'd been as Ranma at his peak. There was still room for improvement, but only grandmasters on the level of Haposai, Cologne and Shang-Chi, among others, would be able to tell. Finally Izuku decided to end the fight, and within moments had Kendo in a lock with her arms behind her back while he had a leg up and wrapped around Ojiro's throat, holding him fast lest he wanted to be either asphyxiated or get a permanent pain in the neck, not seeming to be having any issue holding the unorthodox position. There was a moment of stillness as Izuku's sparring partners realized that they were beaten, and rather handily at that. Then they relaxed and Izuku released them, settling back onto his feet before stepping back. Kendo and Ojiro turned to Izuku and bowed respectfully, recognizing that he was definitely the superior fighter, Izuku bowing back with a smile. The teens that had been watching immediately began clapping at the incredible display they'd just witnessed, more than one shout of, "Amazing!" or, "Manly!" ringing out. "You two are good," Izuku said with a smile, not appearing to even be breathing with any difficulty. "You beat us like a rented mule," Kendo said slightly sardonically as she straightened back up. "We didn't have a chance, did we?" Ojiro asked as he did the same, a hand rising to his neck, rubbing it lightly. "There's always a chance," Izuku said firmly, and everyone quieted down when they heard the steel in those words. It doesn't matter how far beyond the radix point it is, how powerful your opponent, be they a god or a devil, there's always a chance. You only have to seize it. His assistants weren't the only ones to straighten their spines at that. Once that was over, Izuku turned to the rest of his class. "All right, now that you've seen what we can do, I want to know if any of you have any formal training. It can be armed or unarmed, I just want to know what your capabilities are at this point in time." There was a moment where all the teens glanced at each other before Yaoyorozu raised her hand. "I studied some bojutsu in order to better use the staves I make with my quirk," she said. Izuku nodded and began walking back to the position he'd taken for his spar with Kendo and Ojiro. As he turned to her he murmured, "Trace on," a beautiful red enameled staff materializing in his hands which he briefly spun before taking a light stance. "Show me," he told her with a smile. For a moment he was confused when she, and many of the other teens, looked at him in surprise and some shock. Then he realized that this was the first time he'd ever traced anything in front of them. He sighed internally at himself, but the damage was done. Besides, he hadn't intended to hide the ability anyway. It had just never come up. "Well?" he asked, trying to get her moving. Yaoyorozu shook herself out of her surprise at seeing someone else create an item in a similar way as she did and stood up, making her way to her position opposite him as she pulled up the sleeve of the well-tailored gi she'd purchased for this, creating her own staff before settling into the stance she was most confident in. She knew she had absolutely no chance against him, not after how he'd beaten Kendo and Ojiro, but she was determined to give a good accounting of herself. When he motioned for her to begin, she advanced, her focus entirely on this match. Everyone watched as Izuku once again displayed his skill. His staff danced, blocking, parrying, and redirecting with ease, his weapon tapping her body multiple times to demonstrate each time he could have hit her, though he never used force to do so, only demonstrating. Once her 5 minutes were up, Yaoyorozu stepped back, breathing heavily as Izuku settled into a relaxed stance, a smile on his face. "Not bad," he said. "You have some promise in bojutsu, definitely. We'll be focusing on that first with some unarmed techniques thrown in. Usually I'd focus more heavily on the hand-to-hand, but you will rarely be weaponless, so we should take advantage of that." The ponytailed girl smiled gratefully at the praise before stepping back as he turned to the rest of the class. "All right everyone, get up. It's time to get to work," he said with a smile and a glint in his eyes. "Ready?" "Yes, sensei." The group responded, everyone eager to learn. Izuku's smile widened. This was going to be fun. Monday morning found Izuku sitting in his classroom, phone in hand as he played his favorite mobile game while he waited for class to start. "Oh, dude, you play hero, great mission too," Kaminari's voice said from behind him, where he had been talking to Mineta about something Izuku wasn't paying much attention to except for the fact that it involved girls. Izuku turned to look at the sparkplug with a smile on his face. "Yeah, then again, there aren't that many teams that don't, as far as I'm aware. Even I do, though I'm strictly free to play," Uraraka said with a giggle from the seat next to Yaoyorozu's, who she'd been asking for some advice with something in one of their textbooks. Said Eris was looking somewhat bemused by the conversation, apparently one of those said few that didn't play the game they were talking about. What's your favorite hero you've managed to pull? I have a 4-star 13 I've taken very good care of. I'm so glad she got a strengthening recently. I know he's not rare, but I love my 3-star Crimson Riot. Hiroshima exclaimed with a big grin. He's an amazing tank, especially for his rarity. Summer event swimsuit Mirko, Mineta said, looking extremely proud of himself, prompting a nice and high five from Kaminari. 5-star gang Orca, Asui chimed in, a small smile curling her lips. Iida blushed even as he sat as stiff as a board. Quote. 3-star Ingenium, he muttered, seeming embarrassed. My pride and joy is my 5-star limited All Might from the Den of Devils chapter's release draw event. Izuku said with a smile, turning his screen to show said unit off. I spent so much money to get him, my mom grounded me for a week. He said ruefully as he studiously ignored Bakugo's jealous glare. He remembered hearing the blonde shout about not getting All Might no matter how many times he pulled back when the event happened. That's awesome, man. That's the best unit in the game. Bosses are probably a cakewalk to you. Hiroshima said with a grin. Something like that, Izuku said with a nod of agreement before glancing at the time on his phone and raising his voice to be heard by his classmates. All right everyone, get to your seats. Aizawa-sensei should be here any moment now. Everybody quickly raced towards their seats, none of them wanting to possibly incur Aizawa's wrath by not being ready for even an instant. Almost as though summoned, the door opened just as the last person, Sato, took their seat, letting the perpetually lethargic Aizawa into the room. He glanced around the classroom, seeing all the students seated silently and staring forward attentively, before grunting in approval and making his way to the front of the class. Today's heroics class will be a bit different, he said without fanfare. Fighting villains is all well and good, but there's another, likely more important aspect of being a hero that you all need to be prepared for. He said before picking up a card sitting on his podium, turning it to show the class that it had rescue printed on it. Today we'll be doing rescue training, with All Might, myself, and 2 others supervising. When his class started murmuring to each other excitedly, he flared his quirk, prompting them all to shut up very quickly. The facility we'll be using is some distance away, so we'll be taking a drive. He hit the button that prompted their costumes to slide out of their spaces along the wall. It's up to you if you want to wear your costumes for this. Some might not be suitable for the job. With that he turned and proceeded to walk out of the room. Be out front in 15 minutes. Once he was gone, Izuku got up and made his way over to the case holding his costume. All right everyone, you heard the man. Let's get going. I, for one, don't want to find out what he'll do to anybody that's late. Nobody needed any further urging, and they were all soon rushing for the cases. Fiddling with his web shooters while leading his classmates out of the main building, Izuku looked around to find 2 long buses waiting to take them to the place they'd be doing their rescue training at. Making his way toward the one Aizawa was standing next to, he glanced behind him to make sure everyone was accounted for before addressing his teacher. Class 1A, reporting for duty, sir. Aizawa simply nodded once he looked over the group to confirm the class rep's words. All right, we'll be leaving once the rest of today's class shows up. Excuse me, sensei, but what do you mean by the rest of class? Iida asked from where he stood near Izuku, his helmet under his arm. I think he means them, Asui said, pointing back toward the school building, the rest of 1A following her finger to find their sister class approaching, all of them dressed in their costumes as well. Aizawa grunted as the 1B homeroom teacher, Vlad King, approached him. You're late. Vlad King rolled his eyes at his colleague's words. By half a minute, at most. We're sharing rescue training with Class 1A, sensei. Saburuba Kosei asked his teacher, obviously surprised. Vlad King nodded in answer. It was a last-minute decision by the principal. He thought it might be a good idea for you all to bond more than the 2 heroics classes usually do. Think of it as an experiment. We're wasting time. Aizawa cut in. We should get moving. 1A in this bus, 1B in the second, he said while indicating to the bus he was standing beside, his students promptly doing as told. Once they were all seated and on their way to wherever it was that they were going, Asui turned around in her seat to look at Izuku, who was seated behind her, next to Uraraka. Midoriya-kun, I tend to be blunt and to the point, so I'm just going to come out and say it. Your quirk doesn't make sense. Izuku couldn't help but sweat drop at the frank appraisal, especially when he noticed all other conversation on the bus had stopped as everyone, Bakugo included, turned their attention to him, inquisitive. Even Aizawa cracked open an eyelid out of apparent interest. Oh, how so, Asui-chan? The frog girl let out one of her adorable croaks before continuing. First off, call me Sue. And you have too many different, unrelated abilities. There's your superhuman physical stats, for one, like your strength or flexibility. There's also that gun you carry, which you mentioned as part of your quirk, even if we've never seen you use it. Yaoyorozu, who was seated in the window seat next to Uraraka, added. Along with the fact that you seem to be able to create items in a similar manner to how I do. You've also got telekinesis, Uraraka continued, like during the ball toss of Aizawa's assessment, or when you levitated. You can even stick to stuff to climb walls. There's also your martial arts abilities, though I'm assuming that's not necessarily related to your quirk, but it's still amazing just how skilled you were at our age. Ojiro put in. Izuku wasn't really surprised that his classmates were curious, but apparently he'd underestimated just how much. Looking around and finding everybody laser-focused on him, waiting for an explanation, he let out a small sigh as he prepared himself to give them the story he'd been cobbling together ever since he'd woken up after obtaining One for All and everything that came with it. Yeah, I'm not surprised it seems weird to all of you. It does appear like I have a bunch of different quirks instead of just one. But all of my abilities are actually born from a single source. Seeing he had everyone's attention, he continued his explanation, hoping it was believable. I call my quirk focus, and the first thing you should know is that for almost my entire life, I was thought to be quirkless. I had no idea I had a quirk at all till only a few weeks before the entrance exam. What, really? Hiroshima blurted out, shocked. No way, dude, you've got to be the strongest guy in our class. He didn't seem to notice Bakugo's growl at that statement, though Izuku was surprised that the blonde kept it at that. He must have been very interested in Izuku's explanation. Izuku shrugged. It's true. I had no idea I had a quirk. My doctors, my mom, they all thought I was quirkless too. A somewhat bitter smile appeared on his lips. It made for a difficult childhood. His classmates all looked sympathetic, which he appreciated. Anyway, the reason for that is because my quirk actually needed to build up enough power over time to activate, but because I had no clue that was the case, I didn't do anything that could hurry it along, which is why it took so much time. On the other hand, that was a blessing in disguise, since once it did activate it was a lot more versatile than it otherwise would have been had I been younger. Hagakure, who was leaning on the back of Izuku's seat, shifted in a way he thought meant she was tilting her head. What do you mean? Izuku took a breath. I call my quirk focus, because it's essentially energy that I can use in various ways by focusing on what I want to do. And since I didn't have any idea I had it, my focus was scattered throughout my entire life, which left me with all my passive abilities. Seeing that none of them was getting it, not that he was surprised, he explained. Even before I was diagnosed as quirkless, I fantasized about what my quirk would be, and how I'd use it. I imagined it could be super strength, like All Might, or something that would let me access places others couldn't, or an emitter ability, or something like Yaoyorozu's quirk, and so on. So, since those had all been things I focused on, when my quirk activated it modified me, giving me versions of all those abilities, if not at as strong a level as it would have any single one. It just changed you? Shiro asked, confused. Izuku smiled sardonically. I was actually training myself by cleaning Dagoba Beach when it activated, since even without a quirk I wanted to try the entrance exams. He smiled when he saw his classmates were impressed by his guts. It hurt a lot, and the next thing I knew I woke up in a hospital room, being told I'd been in a coma for a week. A week? Mineta asked, gawking. Izuku nodded. That's how long it took my quirk to modify my body to fit the many abilities it was giving me based on what I'd focused on. I'm told All Might just happened to be passing by and noticed me passed out on the beach, so he brought me in. He smiled before continuing. Anyway, while I was out, my quirk changed my body to be stronger, more durable and more flexible, along with my ability to stick to surfaces, as you all noticed. It also created my gun, since having a ranged combat option would be a good addition to my close combat skills. It also increased my intelligence a bit too, though I'm not sure by how much, along with having had the effect of giving me my telekinetic abilities, though those took a bit of experimenting with, and I'm still learning how to wield them. As he explained, he made sure to leave out any mention of his spider sense. It was too big a trump card for him to let out, even among those he thought he could trust. What about your ability to create items like you did during the lesson you gave us? Yaoyorozu pressed, obviously very interested in the answer to that particular question. That's an extension of why I call my quirk focus, because I can temporarily increase my abilities using the leftover energy that my quirk didn't use to modify me. He explained, even as he hoped they would buy what he was selling. Of all his lives, the only ones that had any particular acting ability were Jesse and Peter, and even then they hadn't been great at it. He only hoped he would pass the skill check for this little performance. If I focus on it, I can increase my physical abilities several times over for a short time, or I can create temporary weapons with various effects that will fade after a certain amount of time. I can also increase my telekinetic abilities to lift heavier things or launch them with more force. Seeing that his classmates were looking at him with a bit of awe, he tried to bring them back to earth. Doing that is dangerous, though. If I push my abilities too far, I can damage myself. Like forcing too much air into a balloon. Eventually it can't take any more. Several people winced at the comparison. Still, that's an amazing quirk, Midoriya-kun. Iida exclaimed, chopping his hand. You must have worked extremely hard to get enough of a handle on it to do what you did during the entrance exam. Uraraka nodded vigorously at that, though she was blushing at the memory. Yes, you were so amazing then. I can only imagine how much better you'll be by the time we graduate. I'm sorry you had to think you were quirkless for so long though, Midoriya-kun. Ashido said with a small, sad smile. I'm guessing you must have been bullied a lot. Izuku let out a sigh at the memories. He glanced over at Bakugo, who was resolutely staring out the window, a scowl firmly on his face. Some days were harder than others, he admitted, but I got through it. I imagine others in my position weren't so lucky, he said softly. There was a moment of silence in the bus for a moment before the vehicle came to a stop and Aizawa got up. As interesting as this conversation has been, we've arrived. The students filed out of the bus, finding their sister class doing the same, and once both classes were gathered they were led towards the large dome-shaped building that sat in front of them, the letters, USJ, stamped above the entrance. As they walked in they found an expansive space apparently divided into sections that Izuku assumed were meant to simulate the various environments rescues would need to be performed in. Off to one side he could see an area that looked like a cityscape in the aftermath of a severe earthquake, or other such catastrophe. At the opposite end was a lake which had a decently sized ship on it, likely for aquatic rescues. Asui should be right at home there. Whoa, what is this? Universal Studios Japan. More than one student asked in awe as they looked around the space they'd been led to. Not quite, said a somewhat muffled voice as a hero in a costume that seemed to be reminiscent of a space suit approached the group. This is the Unforeseen Simulation Joint, or USJ, a facility of my own creation meant to train aspiring heroes in how to best perform rescues. So it is Universal Studios Japan, someone muttered, making Izuku smile in amusement, though his attention was taken by Uraraka when she started bouncing in place next to him, which did some rather interesting things to her upper body. Oh my gosh, it's the space hero, 13. She's my absolute favorite hero. I wanna be just like her. The brunette practically squealed with joy at meeting her idol. The heroine chuckled lightly at seeing Uraraka's excitement, feeling flattered. 13. Aizawa said softly once he was near her, making sure that the students wouldn't be able to hear him. Where's All Might? The woman sighed as she held 3 fingers up to illustrate what she was about to say, something which Izuku easily caught on to. He went over his time limit this morning and is resting in the teacher's lounge right now. Aizawa immediately began to grumble irritably about foolish, irrational show-offs as Vlad King just sighed in irritation. Fine, let's get on with it then, the Blood Hero said. Before we begin, I have a couple of points to go over, 13 said, addressing the students. Then she paused. Or 3, maybe 4, there was more than one sweat drop amongst the gathered teens as 13 cleared her throat. As I'm sure many of you are aware, my quirk is called Black Hole. With it I can in and tear apart anything I encounter. Izuku smiled fondly as Uraraka nodded excitedly. And you've used it to save hundreds of people from all sorts of disasters. She practically squealed. Indeed, the heroine said, a smile audible in her voice. However, something that many people seem to forget is that my powers could be used to kill instead of save with horrifying ease. That seemed to take the wind out of Uraraka's sails, along with many other students who had been looking at the pro with excitement. Izuku nodded in understanding, well acquainted with the point 13 was trying to get across. It was something that he was sure some of his schoolmates hadn't considered. Even some of the most gentle members of the first-year classes could do some horrifying things if they put their minds to it. It is easier to destroy than it is to create or preserve, Tokiyami said, his voice thoughtful. 13 pointed to the bird-headed boy, nodding. Precisely. In a society like ours, where the usage of quirks is restricted and monitored heavily, some people even say excessively, it may seem like things are stable. But never forget that all it takes is one wrong move with an out-of-control quirk for people to die. The 40 students were silent as they let the impact of 13's words sink in, several looking introspective or even worried. Once she was certain that her words had had the appropriate effect, 13 continued her speech. During your teacher's physical tests you learned what you're currently capable of, and what your potential could be. In All Might's battle training you saw what your quirks can do when used against other people. She panned her gaze along the students gathered in front of her. Just like then, this class is meant to give you a new perspective. In this case, how to use your quirks to save lives. Izuku smiled in approval at the last words of her little speech. Your powers are not meant to inflict harm. I hope that you will leave here understanding that you're meant to help people. As the space hero bowed, indicating the end of her lecture, the class clapped, many of them seeming to have a new appreciation of their newest teacher, especially the exuberant Uraraka. Aizawa was standing off to the side with Vlad as 13 spoke, looking at his watch, counting down the seconds with a bit of irritation, much to his coworkers' amusement. You know this is an important point that she's making, Vlad said idly. Aizawa grunted. Doesn't change the fact that it's eating up precious time, especially since we have 2 classes here instead of just 1, with 1 less teacher than expected. He shook his head irritably. I wonder what possessed Nezu to make such a last-minute change. Once the students finished clapping he looked up at them. All right then, first off, he paused as heard something off come from the central plaza behind him. Turning around, Vlad doing the same, they saw a swirling spot of darkness begin to grow in front of the fountain. When a gray-haired young man with severed hands attached to his body, including one on his face that acted as a pseudo-mask, stepped out of the spatial distortion, the eternally tired teacher's eyes sharpened as he turned, shouting an order. Huddle up and don't move. As the students caught sight of what was happening, the hand-covered man was joined by several other individuals, with more coming out of the now much larger portal every moment. The hell's that? Are those more battle robots for us to deal with, sensei? Tetsu asked his homeroom teacher, confused, even though he and all the rest of the students could already tell that this wasn't anything so simple. Vlad, glaring down at the ever-growing gathering by the fountain, answered his student. Not even close. Those are villains, Aizawa finished grimly as he put his goggles on. The villain that appeared to be made of the same smoke as the portals narrowed the twin slits of yellow light that made up his eyes when he saw the teachers and students. What's this? There are more students here than there should be, according to the schedule one obtained. And why is Vlad King here instead of All Might? The gray-haired, hand-covered villain said in a voice that was both lethargic and most definitely unhinged. beginning to scratch his neck in a compulsive manner. You can't add a mini-boss and more mobs and then just not have the final boss here. I guess now we know who's responsible for the security breach, Vlad said seriously as he cracked his neck, preparing himself for a fight. This isn't fair, the villain continued, still scratching his neck as an enormous villain with a bird-like head with an exposed brain took its place next to him, staring blankly. Our purpose is to kill the symbol of peace. He can't just not be here after we've come all this way and gathered all these playmates, he said as the large gathering of villains glared up at the heroes and heroes-to-be. Izuku tensed when the villain stopped scratching, becoming unnaturally still. Perhaps a few dead kids will make him appear. Izuku only vaguely listened as his classmates discussed the fact that the intruder sensors weren't going off, along with the fact that it would be difficult for help to get to them considering how far from campus they were as his eyes darted along the mass of enemies, analyzing, considering. He reached into his coat, drawing the service weapon and holding it in a half-ready position as Aizawa and Vlad King prepared to take the fight to the villains. He could already tell that, despite the apparent ringleader's seeming immaturity, this was a very well thought-out attack. Now the only question was who was actually behind it, and if they had any aces up their sleeves. They had to, if they planned to kill All Might in a straight-up fight. With a call to 13 to watch over the students, Aizawa leapt into the fray, Vlad King right behind him. Izuku nodded with satisfaction as he watched the ranged combat villains become completely ineffective under Aizawa's gaze, allowing the homeroom teachers to get an early advantage in the battle. Izuku turned from the fight and focused on his classmates. As much as he wanted to dive in and deal with the invading villains as well, he needed to focus on keeping the other teens safe. Time to go. Indeed, 13 said with a nod, beginning to make her way to the doors. We need to evacuate you all and contact the rest of the teachers. I'm afraid I can't allow that, the warping villain said as he appeared in their way in a swirl of darkness. As the gathered students all stopped in front of him, several taking battle stances, he continued to speak. Greetings. We are the League of Villains. We have come to one of Japan's bastions of heroism for one purpose, to end the life of All Might, the symbol of peace. Izuku didn't wait any longer, lifting his gun and firing, barely taking long enough to aim. The shot impacted against the villain's gaseous body, producing a clanging sound from somewhere within, which made the villain grunt with pain, flinching slightly. Before he'd even finished the movement, Bakugo was there, taking advantage of the situation, Kirishima and Tetsu launching themselves forward on either side of him to keep their opponent pinned. The two hardening fighters slammed a kick and punch, respectively, into the villain's body, showing a bit of what Izuku had taught them, though it was unpolished, with Bakugo following up with a blast that seemed to obscure the villain from view briefly. Not if we take you down first, Bakugo said with a smirk, his palms crackling slightly with small explosions. You, the villain growled, pained and angry. Students you may be, but you're definitely skilled. His eyes locked on Izuku, who was still aiming at him. And more than a bit ruthless, it seems. Get away from him. 13 yelled out to the students a moment too late as a wave of darkness swept out to envelop the teens. Be gone, the villain shouted. Even before the wave had begun to move past a surprised Bakugo, Izuku was moving, launching webs at students and pulling them away from the wave. He had managed to get 7 of them away, though he wasn't focusing on who, before he was enveloped by the dark fog as well and felt himself be transported somewhere else. Damn it. 13 growled as she looked around to see the amount of students that remained was small, yet more than expected. She saw Yaoyorozu, Kota, Uraraka, Shoji, Shiro, Tsunotori and Iida were all getting up from where they'd landed after being pulled away. Where is everyone? Tsunotori cried once she got a good look around. Itsuka, Setsuna. Shoji extended his multiple limbs once he was on his feet, forming ears on most of them. I can hear fighting going on throughout the facility, not just in the plaza, so they're still in the building. What do we do now, sensei? Komori asked 13, staring nervously at the warping villain, who was gazing at them calmly, waiting to see what they did, apparently recovered from the initial attack. Iida, you need to run back to the main school building and alert the teachers as to what's going on here. 13 told the speedster. I can't just leave you all behind. Iida exclaimed as he glared at the warping villain, who was apparently waiting to see what they'd do. Iida-kun, I understand how you feel, Yaoyorozu said as she approached, a bow staff in hand and held at the ready. But you can do more first by leaving and getting help from the pros than by staying here and adding another combatant. Iida grit his teeth but eventually nodded as he got ready to run. I understand. It is foolish of you to speak of your plans so openly in front of me, the villain said condescendingly. Now you have even less of a chance to succeed than you already did. It doesn't matter if you could hear our plans. It's not as if you'll be in any position to stop us. 13 declared as she pointed at him, the cap of one of her costume's fingertips popping open as an intensely strong force began to drag the warping villain toward the pro-hero. Go, Iida. Even as Iida began to move, the villain reacted. Useless, he declared as a portal appeared in front of him, shielding him from black hole's effects. It seems a rescue hero can't measure up when it comes to a fight, he declared as the exit point of the portal appeared right behind the space hero, prompting her own quirk to rip her costume and body apart. 13. Uraraka screamed as the hero fell to the ground in critical condition, having managed to shut Black Hole off in time to keep the damage from being immediately fatal, but still out of the fight. Iida hesitated when he saw what happened to the teacher, but immediately began to run at Yaoyorozu's commanding shout for him to go even as she fell to her knees beside the hero, beginning to produce bandages as Kanoko moved to help. I don't think so, the villain said. We only need to wait for All Might to appear, he said as he appeared in Iida's way. The rest of the teachers aren't part of the equation. He was distracted, however, when two horns flew at him, barely missing but drawing his attention long enough for Shoji to leap forward and envelop him in his appendages. Iida kept running frantically, as fast as he could, gaze locked on the doors leading out of the facility. The villain wasn't going to give up, however, warping out of Shoji's grasp before beginning to open a portal in front of Iida. Before it had fully formed, however, Uraraka was there, eyes narrowed in determination. I don't know what this metal thing is, she said as she reached into the dark cloud that made up the villain's body to grab and cancel the gravity of a metal cylinder which was slightly dented. But I imagine if you're protecting it, it's important. She tossed the cylinder away, the villain's gaseous body following. Zero, she called. On it, the boy exclaimed, launching his tape at the cylinder, taking hold of it before heaving it around and launching it as far away from their position with a yell of exertion. Kurogiri watched as the speedster opened the doors and escaped. It's a race now, he said as he began warping back to the main plaza. Who will succeed first, the villains, or the heroes? Hey, watch it, Ashido cried as she dodged a large rock thrown at her by an even larger villain with a move that showcased her flexibility, skating away on a trail of acid through the landslide zone. As she drew the villain's attention, Shota Narangeki approached him from behind before leaping up as high as he could, launching a punch at his enemy. Two resounding smacks rang out upon impact, the villain dropping to the ground, knocked out. Not too far away from that little encounter, Rin Hirayu was firing the scales on his arms at a small group of long-ranged attackers, keeping them pinned down and occasionally dodging counterattacks. While Rin kept them in place, none of the villains noticed the ground underneath them beginning to soften at first. It was only when they began to sink in that they noticed, and by then it was too late, as hands sprouted out from under their legs and dragged them down up to their waists in the now quicksand-like substance. Once they were helpless and panicking, Ojiro dropped from above, giving them each a smack with his tail and sending them to unconsciousness. Of course, the main reason that they'd all been able to have such a relatively easy time of it was that most of the villains had been engaged and defeated by 1A's class representative. Izuku stood not far from the group, surrounded by unconscious villains and fighting one that appeared to be made of blocks, his angular body hard and moving oddly. Come on, the villain said, roaring with laughter. Is that all you can do? You're barely tickling me. Izuku huffed, annoyed. The other villains had been easy to deal with, generally small fry that showed how much the leaders of this operation underestimated the students. That or they just recruited whatever 2-bit thug they came across. This guy was tougher, but only in that he was more durable. He didn't have time to deal with this. While he was confident that his classmates could deal with anything that came their way if this was the caliber of opponent they'd be encountering, something told him that the villains had something up their sleeves for All Might himself. Which meant it was a danger to everyone in the facility, if not the school. So it would be best if he dealt with it ASAP. He'd been holding back in order to not use excessive force, but it looked like this guy merited a bit more effort. As the block villain opened his mouth to taunt him again, Izuku appeared in front of him, fist against his stomach. "Kachu Tenshin Amagirikan," he murmured, inaudible over a loud sound similar to tearing paper which rang out over the area. The block villain immediately went from laughing at Izuku to hunched over, vomiting up the contents of his stomach before falling over, unconscious. Izuku turned towards the other students, who were finishing up their own fights. "I'm going to run for the plaza," he told them. "Catch your breaths and head for the entrance to regroup with the others. And stay together." Without waiting for a response, he began to run, something telling him time was of the essence. Ashido bit her lip, a bit worried. "I hope he doesn't have any trouble." Ojiro patted the pink girl's back reassuringly. "He could probably beat everyone in both our classes on his own with his hands tied behind his back. He'll be fine," he said as Hononuki finished climbing out of the ground. Shota nodded in agreement. "Probably. Still, we should do what he said and get moving." The others nodded and began to leave the area, wary of any further attacks even as they each hoped the rest of their classmates were doing all right. "Get back here, punk!" A lizard-like villain yelled as he chased Awase through the ruins zone, his large mouth open and ready to bite down on the teen's head. The hero to be ducked into a shadowed area as he ran, the villain following with some difficulty. Awase abruptly paused as he reached for the steel logs he was carrying. The villain almost overshot him in his surprise, allowing Awase to weld the logs to the villain's leather clothing before moving away, out of striking range. His work wouldn't hold the villain for long, but it gave Kuwaro enough time to emerge from the shadows above the enemy feet first and at great speed, striking his hard head with a crack and making him drop as much as Awase's welding job allowed, unconscious. Elsewhere in the same area, Kodai and Sato were watching a group of villains approach them, the villains laughing and jeering as they prepared to butcher the teens. As the villains charged at them, Kodai picked a long pipe up off the ground and tossed it at Sato as he finished downing some sugar. Before the burly teen caught the pipe, Kodai pressed her hands together, making the pipe grow in size till it was closer to the size of a telephone pole, which Sato held with ease thanks to his boosted strength. The villains paused in their charge, surprised by the sudden change, which was all the opportunity Sato needed to swing his new weapon horizontally, catching all of their opponents and launching them into the wall, where they slumped down, out of the fight. While that was happening, Yanagi was holding another group of enemies off using a variety of rubble that surrounded her, unable to hit them due to most of the remaining group being speedy and/or agile, but making sure they couldn't get close to her. What the villains didn't notice was that she was keeping them distracted as Tokage approached from behind them, split into a multitude of body parts that were approaching separately in order to avoid attracting attention. Once they got close enough, the greenette immediately launched parts of her arms and legs at the villains, the ones not taken out by her initial assault becoming distracted enough for Yanagi to finish them off. Tokage's disembodied head gave Yanagi a grin, the white-haired girl nodding in satisfaction even though her expression didn't change. "What the hell is with these brats?" A mouse-like villain cried out in terror as he ran through the downpour zone, wiping the rainwater from his eyes to keep his vision clear. Unfortunately for him, he wasn't fast enough, as the screeching of a demonic bird coming from behind him was the only warning he got before something grabbed his leg, making him fall to the ground. He desperately clawed at the muddy ground, screaming in fear as he was pulled backwards into an area shadowed by an overhang where an entity seemingly made of writhing darkness was waiting. Then there was a thud, and the screams stopped. Aoyama watched his classmates back while he made sure the bird-headed boy didn't lose control of himself, ready to use the brightness of his quirk to weaken him if needed. The Chunobu was keeping control of himself with difficulty, the gloom of their current area increasing Dark Shadow's power while reducing Tokiyami's control. When the half-French blonde spotted a villain trying to sneak away from the conflict, apparently deciding these teens were too scary, Aoyama helped reinforce the impression by nailing the unfortunate man with a pinpoint shot of his naval laser, his eternal smile taking on a distinctly satisfied edge when the villain let out a particularly girlish scream before falling silent. Elsewhere in the zone, a particularly intimidating-looking villain was stalking through the dark, soaked streets. He was wearing some light samurai armor which was filthy with dried blood and other stains, his dark beard tangled and knotted, and his smile revealing crooked, filthy teeth. All in all, he looked like a deranged bootleg of the hero Yoroi Musha. Around him hovered half a dozen blood-stained blades, ready to defend or, preferably, attack at the first opportunity. Come out, little heroes," he called with a dark glee. He caught sight of something approaching him just in time to move one of his blades in place to block the attack, which turned out to be Kamakiri's bladed fist. "What's wrong, Gramps? Forget the rest of your toys at home," the mantis-like boy taunted. The villain smirked as all of his weapons aimed at the teen. "I single blade against all of mine. I think you overestimate yourself, brat." Kamakiri swung a roundhouse kick at the villain, who moved another weapon to block and hopefully take off the student's foot, only to be surprised when the sword was cut in half by the blade that suddenly appeared out of the sole of the boy's foot, which disappeared an instant later as the mantis-like teen planted his feet on the ground, a smirk on his face. "Try to be more than a warm-up, Gramps," he taunted before launching himself at the villain. A street or so away, Kendo was holding off 5 villains on her own. The villains were obviously family, as they looked alike and had similar quirks, which were essentially clawed hands and/or feet. They were fighting as a unit, which made them troublesome, but were obviously relatively unskilled, little more than barroom brawlers, which let her hold her own. She was actually rather amazed. Not at the fact that she was holding them off, she expected that considering their skill levels in hand-to-hand compared to her own. No, it was the fact that she was finding that the pointers Midoriya gave her were very effective. He hadn't had much time to dedicate to working with her, which was understandable, but he'd given her feedback on what he'd seen during their spar. It was mostly relatively small things, but they were surprisingly numerous, which told her even more about his skill than the actual fight, because some of the things he was pointing out were small enough she doubted most masters would notice or care. But she found, as she put his advice to use, that those myriad little corrections and insights added up. It wasn't like she was suddenly leagues better than before, but the difference was noticeable, and it made her very eager to see what else he could teach her once he had more of an opportunity to focus on her. Still, that could come later. First she needed to get through today and make sure her classmates did the same. The problem was that her assailants were just good enough to keep her from taking any one of them out, prolonging the fight as they remained at a stalemate. Thankfully that all changed when a mass of thorny vines suddenly erupted out of the ground underneath 3 of her opponents, wrapping around them and binding them more effectively than most chains. Kendo didn't hesitate despite her own surprise at the occurrence, striking as though she had expected it, taking out the unbound villains with precise strikes to their heads before turning at a bit more sedate pace to do the same to the ones Shiozaki was keeping prisoner. "Thanks, Shio-chan," Kendo said with a smile once the job was done. The vine-haired girl nodded back to her class rep, hands clasped in front of her. "Of course, Kendo-chan. I could hardly let such sinners continue as they had." Kendo turned and began to walk, Shiozaki following her, both of them seeing Kamakiri giving a downed old man in armor a kick in the head before turning to them with a grin as the 2 members of 1A approached. "Let's hope everyone else is having as easy a time of it as us." Todoroki glared with narrowed eyes at the group of villains trapped in his ice. Letting out a foggy breath, he glanced around at the students that had been transported to the mountain zone with him. Jiro had just finished making a group of villains pass out after they were trapped against a wall of onomatopoeia created by the 1B student with a speech bubble for a head, while the big, furry boy with glasses finished knocking out another group that had been trapped by the liquid of the boy with a glue bottle for a head. Todoroki likely could have handled every villain in the zone on his own without breaking a sweat, they were such small fry, but that didn't mean he didn't find seeing how his classmates leveraged their quirks to their advantage mildly interesting. Not to mention it would likely be useful information for the sports festival that would be starting in a month or so. He turned his attention back to the nearest villain, who looked like he was made of a bunch of twigs, and approached him slowly and steadily. The shivering villain eyed him fearfully. "There is no way a bunch of weaklings like you could possibly hope to even bleed on All Might," he said coldly, vaguely aware of his schoolmates approaching behind him as he kept his eyes locked on the villains. So either you're incredibly overconfident, or your leaders have some sort of trump card up their sleeves, and you're just cannon fodder for the other pros and the students. The furry boy, Shishida Jirota, chimed in during Todoroki's pause. I find it highly unlikely that whoever could plan an operation like this, which includes stealing information from an institution such as UA and finding the most opportune time and method to isolate us, would truly expect for such weak fighters to be able to deal with the likes of Aizawa-sensei and Kon-sensei, much less All Might. Which means they most definitely have some sort of plan. Jiro crossed her arms as she gave the twig villain a glare of her own, her earphone jacks lifted up in a threatening manner. In that case, we need to find out what it is so we can warn the pros. Todoroki wasn't sure whether to be irritated by the other team's interruption of his little interrogation, or approving. He disliked receiving help from others when he didn't need it, but the villain was definitely looking more than a bit regretful of his life choices under the gaze of 5 teams that had wiped out a much larger force of villains without appearing to even be really trying. Focusing a bit, Todoroki made the ice, which currently reached up to the villain's torso and had his arms trapped, climb further up his body, making the stick man look down with a bit of panic. So, anything to say? The villain couldn't seem to talk quickly enough after that. TCH, what a bunch of useless weaklings. Bakugo grumbled while wiping the sweat from his brow as the last villain dropped, though the explosive blonde had made sure that his enemy wouldn't fall into the flames of the conflagration zone. These guys think they can kill All Might. How high on his own shit is their boss? They obviously didn't even know what R-ing quirks are, or that warping bastard wouldn't have sent me here, of all places. At least it makes things easier for us, Tetsu said with a grin as he banged his fists together with a clamoring sound. Yeah, now we can go help the others, Kirishima said. If we're here, they must be in USJ too. And not all of them have combat quirks. Like me, Saburaba said from near a collapsed wall that wasn't currently on fire, where he'd been using his solid air quirk to cover the 3 fighters from anybody trying to flank them as they took the mooks out. Besides, we gotta take responsibility for rushing in like that and not letting 13 Sensei just the villain in. Tetsu added as he cracked his neck with an odd, metallic sound. If that's what you want, you extras can do it without me. Bakugo said with his eyes narrowed at the general direction of USJ's entrance. I'm going to kick that warping bastard's ass. Are you still pulling that immature crap at a moment like this? Kirishima asked, surprised. Our attacks didn't do anything to him before. Deku's did. Bakugo grumbled angrily before speaking louder. Think, shitty hair, he's how these guys are getting around. We take him down, they'll be trapped here and unable to run. The pros will mow through him like rice paper, if we don't get to them first. It's not like these assholes even rate, he said as he began walking. Kirishima and Tetsu glanced at each other before Kirishima grinned, prompting his chrome clone to do the same. Sounds like you've actually got a plan and aren't just rushing in for the sake of a fight, Kirishima said, looking amazed and inspired. Of course I've got a plan, dumbass. Tetsu slammed a fist into his palm with an enormous grin on his face, not seeming fazed by the blonde boy's yelling. We're in. As the 3 left Saburaba's side before following along. There was safety in numbers, after all. Besides which, it wasn't a bad plan. He just really doubted it'd go as smoothly as they seemed to think. Asui, Mineta, Kaibara, Kaminari and Monoma were all frozen on the shore of the central plaza that led to the flood zone, staring at their defeated teachers in horror. They had managed to deal with the villains in the waters of the flood zone by working together. Asui had managed to get them all onto the boat after a couple of trips, first bringing Mineta and Kaminari up, then retrieving Kaibara, who had used his limbs as propellers to keep away from the villains, and Monoma, who had copied one of the more aquatic villains' quirks in order to do the same. After a bit of panicking, mostly on Mineta's part, though the others weren't exactly feeling great either, they managed to come up with a plan to get away. Asui lowered Kaibara down to the water, where the teen waited as the villains approached before spinning his leg faster than he ever had before, enough that he'd likely need medical attention before he could walk without issues again. His actions created a small whirlpool that drew the surprised villains in. It wasn't large or strong enough to be more than a momentary inconvenience, but that's all they needed. Once all the villains were in a relatively small area of the lake that made up the flood zone, Kaminari and Monoma, who had copied the blonde's quirk, both conducted as much electricity as they could down some metal wires they'd thrown into the water, electrocuting their enemies and incapacitating most of them. The ones that weren't taken out by the electrical attacks were then hindered by Mineta, who threw his pop-off balls at them with surprising precision, sticking them together as the short boy thanked his lucky stars that he'd been practicing his aim with his quirk with diligence of late. Once all of that was done, Asui managed to get her schoolmates to the shore, though it definitely wiped her out. Unfortunately, they found a disaster rather than safety when they reached the shore. Vlad King sat defeated against a wall not too far away, a leg broken and his chest covered in blood. If not for his quirk, he'd be dead. As it was, he was using his control over his own blood to essentially plug his wounds and keep himself from losing too much more of it for even his quirk to compensate for. He was conscious, at least, giving a smoldering glare at what was happening in front of him. The enormous, beaked villain with an exposed brain had Aizawa pinned against the ground, one of the underground hero's limbs broken in his grip, and skin and some muscle missing from around his elbow. As the teens watched, the huge villain shifted his grip, snapping sounds ringing out in the plaza, though the teacher did little more than grunt, his teeth gritted as he glared at the villain covered in hands, the apparent leader of the entire operation. Canceling quirks is a pretty cool ability, the silver-haired villain said as he stood over the downed crow, his voice just as deranged as when he first showed up to declare he was going to kill All Might. But when up against Nomu's crazy strength, it's nothing special. There was a loud crack as the beaked villain broke Aizawa's remaining intact arm, leaving him completely helpless now, the students all shaking in fear. "This is bad," Mineta whispered. "We need to run away. If he could do that to two pros, we have no chance." Monoma was gritting his teeth, sweating in fear. "I hate to admit it, but he's right." Before they could discuss anything else, the warping villain appeared in a whirl of dark mist. Shigaraki Tamura. The now-named Shigaraki turned his head slightly towards his subordinate. "Kurogiri. Is 13 dead?" "Incapacitated," the humanoid mist said. "Unfortunately, I was unable to warp away some of the students, and one of them managed to escape the facility with the other's help." Shigaraki was silent for a moment, considering that. "Oh," he said after a moment, once it seemed to dawn on him that his plan had failed. His hand reached up to his neck, and he began scratching incessantly, actually drawing a bit of blood. "Kurogiri, if you weren't our ticket out of here, I'd turn you to dust. We stand no chance against dozens of crows, even if we'd likely take several of them down with us." His scratching suddenly stopped. "This is game over." He glared down at Aizawa. "For now." Then, after giving that ominous promise a moment to settle, he spoke again. "We're leaving. We're saved." Mineta Whisper shouted, almost in tears with relief as he hugged Asui, his hand landing on one of her bodies. The frog girl stared blankly ahead as she registered the grope before dunking the now struggling grapehead under the water. "Something doesn't seem right," she said as though she wasn't trying to drown a classmate. Monoma nodded, eyes narrowed as he looked at the villain. "Yes, he's giving up way too easily after all of this." Asui let Mineta up when Shigaraki spoke again, a shiver going down her spine. "Before we leave, though," the villain said, voice laden with dark anticipation. "Let's wound the pride of the symbol of peace." And suddenly, with astonishing speed, he was rushing at the teens in the water, hand outstretched at Asui's face. "By killing a few kids." Sue couldn't react in time, only able to feel an immense amount of fear when she realized her death was approaching. Her eyes barely had time to begin to moisten with tears of fear as that hand grew to seemingly encompass her entire vision despite the remaining distance. And then Izuku was suddenly in the air between them, leg coming around in a kick, a look of utter fury on his face. After which came a resounding smack as the greenette's leg struck the unmoving body of the beaked monster, not managing to make it budge an inch despite putting enough force in that kick that there was a significant displacement of air upon impact. "That was scary," Shigaraki said from where he'd stepped back in an instinctive attempt to get away from the attack before his subordinate stopped it. "You weren't holding back. I probably would have been crippled for life if that had connected." He tilted his head to look at Izuku, red eyes glinting from between the fingers of the hand on his face. Nomu. Izuku prepared himself, feeling his spider sense give him a completely unnecessary warning. Get the teachers to safety while I hold them off. He ordered the teens behind him firmly, his tone leaving no room for argument. Kill him, Shigaraki said, finishing his command. Almost before the order had finished being verbalized, the beaked villain, which Izuku was now aware was called Nomu, had swung its fist at the greenette at shocking speeds. Izuku blocked the blow with his arms, focusing one for all in reinforcement to help tank it, unwilling to dodge in case the attack hit his classmates as they scrambled to follow his orders, and even then he felt his arms close to fracturing just from that one strike. He immediately leapt over Nomu, aiming a kick at its exposed brain as he passed, which was avoided. Immediately upon landing he had to contort his body in ways that would have broken a baseline human to avoid a barrage of strikes from Nomu, dodging, jumping and flipping around in a display of acrobatic skill that would put pretty much any gymnast, even a quirked one, to shame. That wasn't to say that he was fighting completely defensively. He launched more than his fair share of attacks, however Nomu didn't seem to register any of them. It went beyond simple toughness, as considering the power of his strikes should be enough to punch through steel plate with ease, his opponent should be at least registering the force of them. But it was like it was, absorbing the shock of the impacts. Izuku's mind, already prodigious in intellect even before you added Ranma's combat genius and Peter Parker's sheer IQ, made the connections immediately. A shock absorption quirk, combined with its enormous base strength and speed, likely would indeed give All Might trouble unless the number one hero could overwhelm the quirk's upper limit of force it could handle at a time. A decent strategy. Still, all quirks had a weakness, and this one's was likely the fact that it was focused on blunt damage. And that wasn't the only option Izuku had available to him. Within a moment and the next Kansho and Bakuya were in his hands, the married blades he'd relied upon so much as Shuru being called forth for their first battle of his current life. Reinforcing the sword to the limit of what they could take without becoming broken, Izuku dodged Nomu's latest strike and swung his blades at the extended arm, cutting through it and severing it above the elbow before backing off. He didn't like being so in his actions, but with the lives of everyone in the facility at risk, not to mention All Might and whatever pro-heroes would be coming with him, he couldn't afford to hold back. Any fallout from his actions was future him's problem. Here and now he needed to focus on keeping everyone alive and well. He was about to attack again, preferably to incapacitate Nomu's other arm, when he was brought up short when the stump of the missing arm began to regenerate at an extreme rate, flesh and bone bubbling out of it in a nauseating display before the exposed muscle was covered once again with blackish skin, leaving Nomu completely fine before it resumed the attack, leaving Izuku to dodge once again even as his mind began rushing at incredible speeds to make sense of what he'd just seen. Was he wrong about shock absorption, and Nomu's actual quirk was super regeneration? That didn't make sense. In this world nobody could have such immense durability naturally without a quirk, as far as he was aware. Even in all his previous lives, some sort of external or extra factor would be needed to justify it. Even Ryoga, who was Izuku's standard for how ungodly tough a baseline human could get through training and sheer will, would not be able to just tank the kinds of blows Izuku was dishing out without even shifting his stance. And if he was wrong about shock absorption, why didn't that durability translate to protection from cutting damage? Yes, Nomu was tougher to cut than most would be, but not to an extent that matched his protection from blunt damage. It was too lopsided to be natural. Did that mean he had two quirks? Maybe more. That should be impossible unless it was an extreme outlier such as One for All, and the likelihood of someone would not only have multiple quirks, that also just so happened to be a combination that would be an almost hard counter to All Might's abilities, that would then also be found and used by the villains attacking with the intent to kill said symbol of peace. Yeah, no, someone had found a way to stuff multiple quirks in a single person and bioengineered a weapon against All Might using those skills. And Nomu was definitely a weapon. The way it didn't seem aware of anything, only acted when following orders or when protecting its handler, and seemed to be unable to think for itself beyond how to carry out said orders, told him that whoever Nomu had been before, that person was either long gone or buried so far down there was little point in trying to reach them. Whether that was a purposeful result of the experimentation or a side effect, Izuku didn't know. It wasn't his first time seeing humanoid weapons like this, and it never failed to leave a sour taste in his mouth. All of that went through Izuku's mind in a few instants as he dodged Nomu's attack, landing in front of the surprisingly intact fountain at the center of the plaza. He tensed when Shigaraki spoke, sounding both annoyed and curious. "You're good, for a student. That makes you a threat. Nomu, stop playing around and kill him now." Izuku's spider sense blared at him as Nomu drew his arm back, and he quickly leapt high into the air to avoid the absolutely absurd punch that hit the fountain and destroyed it in an instant, sending stone shards flying at dangerous speeds from the point of impact. Izuku tensed even as he fell back towards the ground, ready to continue the fight, but his eyes widened in horror as he heard a sound he was unfortunately familiar with. A girl screaming in pain. "Huh?" Shigaraki asked, confused, before a malevolent grin grew on his face as he realized what that sound meant, his glee obvious in his voice when he gave Nomu a new command. "Change of plan, Nomu. Kill her instead." "What the hell is he doing?" Shiro asked from where he was watching the events down in the plaza alongside Yaoyorozu, Monoma and Shoji, the rest of the teens near the entrance tending to the injured teachers. The reason for his question was the fact that, after spending the entire fight dodging Nomu's attacks with relative ease and managing to gravely wound the villain, Izuku had decided to now plant his feet in one spot and just tank all the strikes, which was not a winning strategy in any sense of the word. He actually seemed to be purposefully moving to take hits that would have missed him if he hadn't done so. Even from the current distance the teens could see that he was becoming battered and bruised, a trickle of blood escaping his mouth even though the green electricity that they thought was evidence of him actively using his focus quirk was likely boosting his strength and durability. "It doesn't make sense," Yaoyorozu agreed. He was stalling that villain fine. What could he hope to accomplish by getting himself beat up? "I thought he was better than that," Monoma said, his eyes narrowed as he glared down at the sight of Izuku taking a beating, looking disappointed. "There's something we're not seeing. He has to have a reason," Yaoyorozu said before turning to Shoji, who had been keeping an eye and ear on what was going on below, relaying what was being said to them. "Was anything said before Midoriya shifted tactics? I thought I heard a girl scream when the fountain was broken," Shoji said slowly, and then Shigaraki said to Killa, Her. Who? There's nobody down there but Midoriya and those three villains," Shiro said, confused. Yaoyorozu's eyes widened in horror, and with barely a thought she created some binoculars, bringing them up to her eyes and focusing first on Izuku, then on the ground around him. It took her a moment to spot what she'd feared to find. Not even 5 steps behind Izuku, in the area he wasn't allowing the villain to even begin to approach, were several small puddles of blood. It was when she saw them slowly increase in size without any obvious reason that she confirmed her hypothesis. "He's protecting Hagakure-chan," she gasped, bringing the binoculars from her face and handing them absently to Monoma, who immediately looked through them as she continued to explain. "She must have been hit by the shrapnel from the fountain when it was hit, and now the villains are focusing on killing her in order to force Midoriya-kun to take the blows meant for her. Those rocks could have killed her," Shiro exclaimed in shock. "Goddammit, what was she doing there?" Monoma turned to Yaoyorozu. "Could you create a distraction? That would draw their attention to us, and we have several wounded pros we wouldn't be able to defend if the villains decided to point that monster at them," Shoji said, sounding pained. Yaoyorozu grit her teeth, feeling helpless, but before they could get too lost in worry the situation down below changed. Izuku spat out some blood as he glared at his enemy, who was mindlessly continuing to try to get past him to kill the whimpering invisible girl laying behind him. He berated himself for letting her get hurt, even if there was no way he could have known she was there with as focused as he'd been on the fight. He needed to stop Nomu permanently, but to do so he'd need to overwhelm the monster's regeneration, and he didn't have any way to do that at hand. He could have potentially removed the thing's head, but Kansho and Bakuya had both been destroyed during the fight, and he was sure that it would be programmed to protect such a vulnerability at all costs in any case. So if he couldn't overwhelm the regeneration, how about outlasting it? An idea began to percolate in the Greenette's head, but he couldn't put it into action while his opponent continued to relentlessly harass him. He needed to buy some time to work, even if it was only a few seconds. Ask and ye shall receive, apparently, as Bakugo appeared out of seemingly nowhere with the sound of a thunderous explosion, aiming his palm at the back of Nomu's head and unleashing an enormous blast that engulfed the beaked abomination's head. "How'd you like that, you damn skullless turkey?" the blonde exclaimed with a satisfied grin as the damage to Nomu was revealed. The monster's head was charred black, obviously having received significant damage. Were it a normal villain it would be in critical condition, though Bakugo obviously took the Nomu's strength and durability in mind when launching his blast, not aiming to actually kill. Izuku had to hand it to the explosive boy, even if he didn't like the asshole. The blonde had excellent combat instincts and observational abilities. His loud and straightforward demeanor made it easy to forget his actual intelligence. Of course, Bakugo was in for an unpleasant surprise when he saw the damage immediately heal over. Apparently even a vital point like the head, despite its exposed brain, would need a lot more than that to cause permanent damage. "What the?" the blonde exclaimed angrily before only barely managing to bring his arms up in time to take the backhanded slap the villain almost negligently hit him with, making the Pomeranian go flying with a curse, his grenade gauntlets severely dented and likely the main reason his arms weren't broken. He began to curse louder when Tetsu and Kirishima finally caught up and tried to help him out. Izuku hadn't wasted the opportunity he was given, having uttered his aria the instant Nomu ceased his assault after Bakugo's attack. The weapon he was tracing was almost done coming into existence, being on the sympathizing with the experience of its growth stage, but as Nomu refocused on him, or more specifically, Hagakure, he knew he would likely not be able to finish without further help. Thankfully it seemed like whatever gods might have taken an interest in him decided to give him another helping hand, as a stream of ice streamed across the floor till it reached Nomu's feet, at which moment it spread at astonishing speed to trap the bioengineered villain in a cocoon. Todoroki let out a misty breath from where he stood nearby, the students that had been in the same zone as him ready to fight. "That should hold him." "It won't," Izuku said grimly as he hefted his now complete weapon, being proven right when the ice shattered, leaving an unscathed Nomu standing there. "None of you brats can take out my Nomu," Shigaraki said, sounding amused. "It was specifically created to kill All Might. A bunch of children have no chance of doing more than slowing it down." "You're wrong, Shigaraki," Izuku said strongly, radiating determination as he took an attacking stance with the weapon he'd traced. "I'm ending this now, with a single attack." "Arrogant, aren't you?" Shigaraki said, even more amused. "Nomu, kill him now." As the various teens scattered around the plaza began to react, trying to do something to help Izuku, the greenette simply narrowed his eyes, focusing on the noble phantasm he was about to unleash, the attack that would stop the Nomu for good. As the monster swung its fist at him again, struck. Guy Bold. The gathered spectators weren't entirely sure what happened. One moment Izuku was holding a barbed, ominous-looking red spear pointed at the floor, the next the weapon was buried in the Nomu's chest, piercing its heart, with nothing appearing to have happened between the two events. There was a moment of stillness, the two combatants locked in that tableau for several seconds, before Izuku pulled his weapon back, leaving a deep, bloody hole in the Nomu's chest. "That's it?" Shigaraki asked after a moment as everyone watched the hole begin to bubble with nearly formed flesh in the disturbing way its healing worked. "Even if you pierced Nomu's heart, it can regenerate from that with ease." "You've done, what the hell?" he finished as he saw something he hadn't expected. The wound caused by Izuku's spear was continuously trying to heal over thanks to Nomu's regeneration, but the hole wasn't closing. All that was happening was that the flesh continued to bubble incessantly, Nomu unable to do anything as it waited for the grievous injury to heal. "Why isn't it healing?" Shigaraki asked as he stared at the hole in Nomu's chest. "What did you do?" Izuku maintained his ready stance, prepared for any eventuality. "Your Nomu's shock absorption quirk doesn't protect against bladed damage as effectively, so that part was easy." He began explaining, mostly to buy time for his plan to work, than anything else. "Super regeneration has one primary weakness that I imagine usually isn't a problem, especially if you intend for the Nomu to face All Might, who fights bare-handed. It obviously requires Nomu's energy to function, and likely a not insignificant amount. Guy Bolg is a cursed spear. Its wounds will never heal as long as it or its wielder remain alive. So what happens when super regeneration tries to close a wound that can't heal? It will keep trying, and trying, and trying, continuously using up Nomu's energy, until, almost as if on cue, the monster fell, first to its knees, then to the ground, letting out the first sound it had made during the entire invasion as it did so, a long, low beep. Its energy runs out, and it dies from a wound it can no longer hold at bay. Izuku finished with a frown on his face, looking sadly down at the monster this poor soul had been turned into. He only hoped whoever it had been was at peace now. Everyone stared at what had happened, disbelieving, their eyes locked on the enormous form of the Nomu, a pool of dark blood growing underneath it, before their gazes turned back to Izuku, who let Guy Bolg fade into motes of prana before drawing the service weapon, aiming it at Shigaraki just in case, the villain not seeming to notice as he stood deathly still, staring at his dead weapon. The students couldn't believe what they had just seen 1A's class representative do. No one, from what they'd seen of his personality till now, expected that he would be able and willing to go for the lethal option so seemingly easily. Sure, several of them, especially those that had seen what Nomu was capable of, knew that it was a logical decision considering all other options had failed, but it was still shocking to teens that had never seen someone die before, especially at the hands of a hero. Bakugo was especially shaken, staring with wide eyes at the lifeless form of the villain laying only a couple of feet from Izuku before turning his gaze to said Greenet, who was holding his gun in a steady grip, focused on the remaining villains. He'd known Izuku for practically their entire lives, and the mere idea that the bullied boy that could barely raise his arms to block a punch was not only willing but able to go for the kill with such a hard look in his eyes. Something fundamental had changed in the boy, and it made the explosive blonde uneasy. Shigaraki seemed to finally get over his own shock at what he thought was a practical impossibility coming to pass. His hands rose and he began scratching at his neck with such vigor that it was slightly surprising that he didn't outright rip out his jugular and bleed out. "You killed my Nomu." Izuku shifted his stance slightly, still aiming his weapon at Shigaraki, readying himself for some sort of attack. What are you?" Shigaraki asked, sounding both angry and baffled, the other hero students beginning to regain their senses and prepare themselves to fight as well. "You could hold your own against Nomu in a physical fight, you figured out his quirks through just observing them, and you somehow have a cheat ability that lets you kill anyone you want." He somehow managed to start scratching harder. "I call hacks. Shigaraki Tamura, the situation is not ideal. We need to retreat." Kurogiri cut in, speaking for the first time in a while as he eyed the students that were surrounding the two. "We can't fight a Nomu killer and his comrades on our own." Shigaraki stopped scratching as he glared balefully at Izuku. "This isn't over." "The hell it isn't," Bakugo snapped, managing to get over his shock as he prepared to launch himself at the villains again. Before he could do anything, the doors near the entry burst exploded open, revealing a severely pissed-looking All Might, his customary smile absent from his face. "Don't worry, students, I am here," the symbol of peace announced, eyes taking in the situation before landing on the villains Izuku was holding at gunpoint. Without hesitation he launched himself at Shigaraki and Kurogiri, the only remaining villains currently in sight. The warp villain immediately created a warp gate an inch in front of the blonde missile that was All Might as he fell towards them. Izuku immediately fired on them, hitting Shigaraki in his right arm, making the villain cry out in pain, but he was prevented from firing further when All Might appeared from a portal that appeared right in front of him, his predecessor just barely managing to keep from plowing into the boy, or more importantly, the girl he was protecting. Bakugo, Kirishima, Tetsu and Shishida all launched themselves toward the villains in order to keep them from getting away, even as Todoroki launched a glacial assault for the same purpose. Unfortunately Kurogiri had been faster than any of them, and even as All Might was appearing from the portal in front of Izuku, another portal had come into being underneath the villains, making them drop out of sight faster than a normal retreat would have allowed. By the time the teens and their attacks had reached the location the villains had been, the portal was almost entirely closed, allowing the villains to escape. All Might turned, glaring at the place Shigaraki and Kurogiri had been. Once he was certain the opportunity had passed, he turned his attention to his students after a quick, concerned look at Nomu's corpse. He gave them all a quick look over to make sure they were all relatively intact before he looked at his successor, who even after a quick glance was obviously the one in worst shape, though that assessment rapidly changed when he saw the teen kneeling next to what the pro-hero realized was the injured form of Hagakure, who was still whimpering in pain, a bit too much blood on the ground, outlining her body. Young Midoriya. Go and get recovery girl now. The greenette cut his teacher off, neither one of them noticing the wide-eyed looks he was getting at doing so to All Might, of all people. I should be able to stabilize her, but she has a better chance if you bring recovery girl here rather than waiting to take her to the nurse's office. And that's not even mentioning the teachers and anybody else that may be injured, he said as he pointedly ignored the blood still leaking from his mouth that indicated that he was in just as bad a shape. All Might nodded in understanding as he turned to do as he was told, noting as he did so that the rest of the UA staff was arriving with an exhausted-looking Iida in tow. Do what you can. With that he left the facility with all his prodigious speed. Izuku turned his attention to Hagakure, petting her hair, noting absently that it was very silky, as he projected some bandages to use on her. You're going to be fine, Hagakure-chan. Thank you, the invisible girl said softly through the pain she was feeling. As the others either approached to see if they could help or let the shock of what had just happened set in, none of them noticed Izuku slip a small vial full of Hagakure's blood into his coat. The greenette sighed as he worked, the small part of his mind that wasn't focused on his task going over the attack. All of his experience throughout his multitude of lives was telling him something clearly. This was only the beginning of something. He'd need to make sure he and his schoolmates were ready. And the very fact that an institution such as UA was attacked to the point that there were students in critical condition after being forced to fight for their lives is shocking. What happened to it being the greatest institute of learning in Japan? Oh, come off it. No place is impenetrable, no matter what the creators might try. Nobody can plan for every eventuality, quirk or no quirk. As long as nobody died and UA learns from this fiasco, I call it a win. Nobody died. Tell that to the corpse of the villain that was killed by a student. The fact that UA would not only accept a murderer into the hero course but keep them even after they showed their true colors is disgusting. Are you seriously arguing that a hero should have let a villain kill them and the people they were protecting rather than make sure they were put down for good after exhausting all other options? There are always other options. That student likely joined the hero course in order to obtain a legal license to eyes people. Are you out of your hash and $mind? The supervillain known throughout the world's criminal underworld is all for one shut the television off once the talking heads on the news program devolved to shouting and name-calling, all semblance of civil discussion dead. Honestly, and Yoichi had wondered why he had little respect for most people. The fallout of the League of Villains' assault on UA was still unfolding several days after the event. Even though the original objective had been a failure, AFO still considered the operation a minor success. Not only had UA's and, by extension, All Might's, eye been blackened, the prototype Nomu had been field tested with satisfying results, even if it had been brought down by a child. Oh, but what a child it was. After Tamura told him about what had happened while getting his wounds tended to, AFO had gotten his hands on a copy of the USJ's security footage that had been sent to the police and watched the boys, Midoriya Izuku's, battle with the Nomu. From everything he had seen of the fight, Midoriya was likely already at pro level, with combat abilities and mental acuity that were truly impressive. Beyond just his ability to fight the Nomu was the way he broke down its quirks and abilities and figured a way around them while in the heat of battle, a tactical genius AFO had not seen for some time. There was also the fact that he was willing to fight to kill if necessary. Far too many people forgot that sometimes a hero couldn't bring a villain down non-lethally without incurring heavier casualties on their own side or on civilians, and might be forced to do exactly what the boy did. A hero should always dread the day that eventuality arrived while preparing themselves for it. That was what AFO considered most dangerous about the boy. Beyond his physical and mental abilities, was his willingness to use them to their fullest if needed. Even All Might, and many of his predecessors, had trouble with that aspect of the job at first, and people had suffered for it. Then there was the way the boy spoke to All Might. That was not deference to a respected teacher, or the awe of a revered idol. The way that Midoriya spoke to All Might, and more importantly, the way All Might responded, as though following the boy's orders was natural to him. It seemed All Might had found his successor. This would bear further observation. And thankfully Ua had just announced that they would be continuing with his best opportunity to do so. Nezu strode through the empty halls of UA towards the support course's highest level labs as the setting sun streamed its orange light through the windows, intending on dealing with a situation that was worrying multiple people, including All Might, Power Loader, and Midoriya Inko. The students of the first-year hero course had been given the rest of the week off to recover, mainly due to the fact that some such as Hagakure needed a longer recovery period. The fact that they could all recover at all instead of needing to be buried was a testament to the students' skill and courage. A certain Greenette had promptly disappeared into the support labs the day after the attack and had not left since. Seeing as it was now Friday evening and he had not been home since early Tuesday morning, his mother was understandably worried, despite knowing quite well how competent and mature he was, not to mention why. Walking up to the reinforced door to the lab Izuku had taken over, the diminutive principal quickly typed a code into the security panel next to it, absently wondering how Izuku had bypassed it, before walking into the room once the door opened. The room was crowded with a multitude of items, papers with various messily scrawled notes next to most of them. Further into a corner of the room, out of sight from Nezu's position, came the sound of rapid typing on a keyboard, the clacking quick yet sure. Walking through the room, Nezu paused rather often to look at some of the items that caught his eye. Here he found maneuverability jets, grappling hooks and improved anti-nausea systems for Uraraka's costume. There, a formula for high-density multivitamins to enhance Tokage's regeneration. Further along, outfits made of something called unstable molecules for Kirishima and Tetsu, along with boots with retractable spiked plates to help them anchor themselves to the ground if needed. For Tokiyami, a cape with hidden LED lights lining it for use in case Dark Shadow went out of control. For Jirota, the formula for a drug that would help mitigate the impact his quirk had on his intelligence. All in all, Nezu was extremely impressed by what he was seeing. Izuku had obviously been busy coming up with support items to assist his classmates in case they ever found themselves in a similar situation to USJ. He also found training ideas and programs for those he couldn't help quite as directly, such as investigating to see if Monoma could combine quirk effects. As Nezu turned the corner of the shelves to the location where Izuku sat, he found the Greenette seated in front of a reinforced desktop computer, a wrist-mounted computer with an OLED touchscreen lit up on it attached to the computer by a high-capacity cable as he typed. "So, am I expelled?" Izuku suddenly asked as he continued typing without pause. Nezu was utterly unsurprised that Izuku had noticed his approach. He hadn't exactly been hiding, and for someone as experienced as Izuku, noticing someone approaching them unannounced must be second nature, especially considering recent events. "Of course not," Nezu said with a scoff. "The Hero Public Safety Commission did have some concerns, and the media is being idiotic as usual, but I will resign before I allow you, much less any other of our students, be railroaded in such a fashion. And my leaving would be extremely inconvenient for anybody who instigated it, I can promise you," he said with a rather sharp smile. "Quite beyond your unique circumstances, I would never punish someone for doing what was necessary. You'll turn any negative opinions around soon enough." Izuku huffed a laugh. "Forgive me, but I don't have good experiences when it comes to the press, so I won't hold my breath," he said as he continued typing with one hand, the other reaching for an All Might branded mug of coffee sitting nearby. He took a quick gulp before grimacing, likely at the fact that the liquid was completely cold by now, before continuing to type. "What are you working on?" Nezu asked as he approached, glancing at the sketches and a piece of fabric near a machine that Nezu was 95% sure hadn't originally been requisitioned by the school and appeared somewhat cobbled together. It appeared to be a new costume design for Yaoyorozu, though this one covered her entire body, and once again the words, "unstable molecules," were scrawled in the place of fabric details. An attached note had a formula that it took Nezu a moment to figure out was for high-density, high-calorie nutrition bars to work with the girl's quirk. Yaoyorozu carries a physical book that is a lexicon full of constructs and materials for her to create. Izuku said as he telekinetically pulled an electric coffee thermos from where it had been sitting and keeping warm before pouring some more caffeine into his mug. I've just made a digital version with a search function and a bunch of things she either hasn't thought of or isn't aware of. I plan on seeing if I persuade her to make me some of the truly useful stuff that I know either doesn't exist or hasn't been created in this reality for my use. Such as, Nezu asked, interested in what Izuku would consider useful, and what substances that did not exist in the world at the moment could be or do. Various variations of adamantium and vibranium, mostly. Izuku said as he took a sip of much more pleasant coffee even as he continued typing. I do not believe I have heard of either of those substances. Nezu stated with curiosity. On the earth I lived on as Peter, they were two of the most valuable and useful substances known to man. Izuku said seriously, pausing his typing to underscore his point. Some of the greatest heroes and villains to ever live had weapons made of those substances. Honestly, I was on the fence on giving Yaoyorozu access to their molecular structure. If villains, hell, if some heroes, ever found out how useful some of this stuff is, and that she's probably the only source of it in the entire world, she'd become a huge target. He turned back to the computer. In the end I decided the benefits outweighed the risks, though I'll make sure to explain exactly what those are to her so she can make an informed decision. I hope I'll be able to convince her to at least give me some if she decides never to touch the stuff again. She is the heiress of an almost ludicrously wealthy family, Midoriya-kun. How exactly do you intend to convince her if she doesn't want to? Nezu asked, mildly amused. I don't know. Manual labor, bodyguard work, covert operations against her middle school bullies. Favors. I'll go through a lot for some vibranium to use in my projects. Izuku said, completely seriously. Nezu blinked, surprised by how determined Izuku was to get whatever this vibranium stuff was. I would appreciate it if you could take your time at some point to explain why this is so important to you, but it seems I've been sidetracked from my original reason for coming. He said before coughing into his paw. You've been holed up in here for too long, my friend. Your mother is worried about you, and while I can understand your reasoning, you've already done quite a bit to assist your classmates so far. You need to rest and relax after the events at the USJ. It's only been a couple of days, Izuku said as he continued typing, adding more information into Yaoyorozu's new lexicon. It's been 4 going on 5. Nezu deadpanned, making Izuku pause and blink before checking his phone, which was laying on the table next to the computer, finding that yes, it had indeed been that long. I'm sure that with your extensive amount of experience you're well aware of how necessary it is to take proper care of your mental health. The principal continued. Go, relax, de-stress. Izuku hesitated, looking down at the work he'd done, before his eyes fell on his jacket, and what rested in one of the reinforced inner pockets. Then he looked back at the chimera. Fine, but under one condition. Nezu raised an eyebrow. Saturday found Inko sitting in front of her television after lunch and flipping through channels while she tried to relax. Izuku had arrived the previous evening after apparently making a deal with Nezu, which the woman was very thankful for. Though she did still have trouble wrapping her head around her son essentially being treated as an equal by people such as the principal or All Might. Still, she knew that he needed to rest after everything that had happened. She really hoped he wouldn't encounter any similar situations at least till he graduated and went pro, though something told her that she shouldn't get her hopes up. Of course, Izuku's current method of relaxation wasn't exactly what Inko had in mind, but if it worked for him, she wasn't going to complain. She had just flipped away from another pundit complaining about the USJ incident when the doorbell rang. The woman frowned in light confusion, wondering who it could be, before getting up to answer. Hello, Midoriya-san, a pretty brunette standing outside of the door said when the door opened, a smile on her face. Inko glanced from her to the other girls standing next to her, one with orange hair done up in a side ponytail and the other with black hair in a fan-like ponytail. Yes. It's a pleasure to meet you, the oranguette said with a small bow. I am Kendo Itsuka, and this is Uraraka Ochako and Yaoyorozu Momo. We're some of your son's schoolmates. We and some of the others were wondering if Midoriya-kun was available to spend the day at the beach with us. We figured it would be good for us all to spend some time together after everything that happened, and we've heard that Dagoba Beach is quite lovely now that someone cleaned it up. Others, Inko asked before stepping out and looking over the railing down at the ground below, finding dozens of teens milling about and talking as they waited. She felt her eyes fill with tears. Midoriya-san, Uraraka asked, concerned. Inko sniffed and wiped her tears away. Don't worry, dear, I'm just so happy to see that my Izuku finally has some friends. Because he grew up thinking he was quirkless. Yaoyorozu asked gently. Inko looked at the girl with surprise. Oh, he told you about that? She gave a shaky smile. Yes, my Izuku grew up quite isolated because of his status. He tried to keep the specifics from me, but I know it must have been difficult. Wiping her eyes again, she spoke a bit more firmly. In any case, he isn't here at the moment, but I can tell you where he went. You should be able to find him there. Thank you, ma'am, Uraraka said with a smile. About 15 minutes later, the group of students who had been able to attend the impromptu get-together found themselves outside of the place Izuku's mother told them he'd be. As this, Tokage began. A homeless shelter, Kaminari finished, blinking in surprise. Before them stood a large community center that had apparently been converted into a homeless shelter some time ago. Iida held a shaking, clenched fist in front of himself, appearing to be overcome with emotion. Truly, Midoriya-kun is an ideal to strive for. Even when he is meant to be relaxing, he is performing community service. So manly, Kirishima and Tetsu exclaimed in sync. We don't know that's what he's doing. Monoma said. He could just be here to visit someone staying here. The boy's tone said he didn't really believe his own words, however. When the volunteers at the shelter saw a large group of teens all enter the building together, they stared in shock before one of them approached. I sincerely hope you all don't need a place to stay. The young woman covered in light red fur said hesitantly. Yaoyorozu stepped forward with a reassuring smile on her face. No, thank you. We're actually here looking for a friend of ours, Midoriya Izuku-kun. Is he here? The woman blinked before smiling. Ah, you're all Midoriya-kun's friends. Well then, we're happy to have you here. I believe he was in the kitchen making some food for our residents. Just go to the back of the building and you should be able to find it. The students did as they were told, thanking the woman as they passed her. When they walked into the main area of the shelter, they found a large, open space cluttered with bunk beds and clothes racks. Against the walls were multiple bookshelves full of training manuals, novels and board games. All about the place were people sleeping, talking or reading, many of them looking up when the teens passed by, appearing befuddled. They passed a couple of older people playing chess as they playfully insulted each other, a man with digitigrade legs doing pull-ups, and a woman reading a storybook to some children. You know, sometimes it's easy to forget how good we've got it. Saburaba said quietly. I mean, intellectually I know that there are homeless people that rely on places like this to survive, but it never really registers till it's shoved in your face. Next to Shiozaki, who had her hands clasped together as she walked, appearing to be praying for the people of the shelter, Sue responded as she observed the kids listening to the story with smiles on their faces. Yeah, we're really lucky. Eventually they reached the far end of the main area of the shelter and found Izuku working on repairing a television rather than cooking. He was working with ease as he spoke to the people around him, a smile on his face. Could you pass me that screwdriver there, please? He asked a girl sitting next to him and watching him work. The girl he was talking to, a blonde in a school uniform with her hair in messy buns and lidded golden yellow eyes, her lazy grin exposing enlarged canines, picked up the tool he was asking for before handing it over. This one, Izuku-kun. Yeah, thanks, Toga-chan. He said as he took it and began screwing something into the television, not seeming to notice how the girl blushed lightly. Midoriya-kun, Uraraka called, making the boy look up with a blink. Oh, hey everybody, what are you doing here? He asked as he finished what he was doing and started hanging the TV up on its mount with the help of a burly man with a pronounced jaw with tusks sticking out of his lower lip. We went to your house to see if you wanted to go to the beach with us for the day and your mom told us you were here. Tokiyami said. Izuku gave the group a surprised look before smiling warmly. I appreciate the thought, everyone, but I'm kinda busy here. Before they could respond, someone called from the kitchen. Yo, Midoriya, it's been a little over 30 minutes since you set this to cook. Izuku's eyes went wide and he raced towards the kitchen with a curse as the tusked man turned the TV on, apparently satisfied when it came on with no issues. I told you to let me know when 23 minutes had passed, Kenichi. What? A couple of extra minutes can't hurt it. The apparently named Kenichi's voice said. Of course it can. I swear, if it got ruined because you got lazy, I'll make you regret it. Izuku said angrily, making his classmates blink in shock, having never heard him be so aggressive. What, you gonna beat me up? Kenichi said tauntingly. No, I just won't let you have any. Izuku said smugly. Toga giggled as Kenichi immediately started to sound panicked. No, wait, I promise to be good. Please don't keep me from your cooking. Please. Huh, I wonder if his cooking is that good. Ashido wondered. Kendo glanced over at Yaoyorozu and Shota, who apparently had the same idea as they nodded. Kendo clapped her hands to get the group's attention. So, what do you all say to a change of plans? The Oranget asked with a grin. The heroes in training all glanced at each other before turning back to the 1B class representative. Let's do it, they cheered. As Yaoyorozu made her way to the main office of the shelter's manager to inform them of what was going on, the teens got to work. Sato, Komori, Tokage and Kaibara immediately moved to the kitchen to help Izuku with the cooking. Honanuki grabbed a low chair and began offering massages to those that felt like they needed them. Su, Kodai, Uraraka, Monoma and Shota moved to help look after the children staying in the shelter. Jiro found a guitar and began to play to entertain the people, with Ashido dancing along to add to the spectacle. Pony came across a group of people trying to practice their English skills for any potential job interviews and immediately jumped in to help, being assisted with her Japanese in turn. Kaminari started charging any batteries people might need. Kirishima, Tetsu, Ojiro and Kendo all began giving any interested residents an impromptu self-defense lesson. Shishida, Mineta and Manga began assisting with people practicing for job interviews. Koda took to looking after the various pets that people brought with them. Shiozaki began a prayer session, which a surprising amount of people attended. And Iida, Aoyama, Shoji, Tokiyami, Saburaba and Yanagi, Bondo and Rin all proceeded to help with odd jobs around the facility. On the second floor of the shelter, overlooking the living space, an older woman in her 60s with canine ears and a tail looked down at all the teens working to assist, Yaoyorozu at her side. You have no idea how grateful we are. The shelter manager said with a joyful smile. Midoriya-kun has been a blessing since he started volunteering here. The fact that his being here led the rest of you to come, even if only for today, I haven't seen this place as lively as it is now for a long time. As they watched Izuku and his helpers bring out an enormous pot of heavenly-smelling fried rice along with various drinks and some salad, Yaoyorozu smiled as well. We're happy to help, Inunaki-san, she said as the girl called Toga leapt onto Izuku's back as he was trying to serve people, prompting him to laugh. We are training to be heroes, and I think this is as important a lesson for us as anything we might learn at UA. Inunaki smiled broadly. Well, if you're any example of what the future will bring, I am definitely feeling quite hopeful. Yaoyorozu then handed the older woman a piece of paper, which she opened to find was a check. Inunaki brought a hand to her mouth in shock as she saw the amount written on it. She gave Yaoyorozu a teary smile, the teenager smiling back softly before turning her gaze back at Izuku as he laughed and talked with the people around him while serving the food. This may not have been how she expected the day to go, but she couldn't find it in herself to complain. Izuku really did seem to have a way to make everything better for everyone around him. The first day of class after the events of the USJ attack found Izuku arriving at the classroom almost an almost full hour early. He'd made sure to leave home earlier than usual in order to speak with Nezu about some ideas he'd had to improve security, among other things, but found out to his chagrin that the principal was actually in an important meeting with the Hero Public Safety Commission, so that had been a waste. So, rather than just wander around campus, bored out of his skull, he headed to his classroom and decided to indulge in one of his hobbies while he waited. During his life as Jesse, having learned from the mistakes of Trench, the previous director of the FBC that she'd replaced, she went on a small hiring spree and got the best mental health specialists in the world to keep an eye on the bureau's staff, with mandatory weekly sessions for every employee, herself included. It had worked out quite well, with monthly fatality numbers dropping a full 19%. One of the things her therapist had noted was that Trench had made the bureau his life to the exclusion of all else. No hobbies, no loved ones, nothing other than the job, and that was part of why he'd met a messy end. So Jessie needed something to ground her, something she enjoyed and could escape to when she needed a breather. Around that time the FBC acquired an altered item that would end up becoming one of her prized possessions, an absolutely beautiful Fender Stratocaster. Of course, being an altered item it had its own quirks, the primary one being that it demanded to be played regularly, making those around it feel anxious and restless until someone did so, the effect subsiding for approximately 27.3 hours after usage before starting up again. However, the upside is that it improved the player's learning curve significantly, so a complete novice, like Jessie, could outplay power metal maestros within a year of constant practice. Music had become her escape, the thing she did when she just needed a moment to de-stress, the guitar always in her office and within easy reach. By the time she died she'd probably been one of the top 5 best guitar players in the world, even if she'd cheated to get there. So now, in the empty classroom, Izuku set up a program of his own making on his phone which automatically stripped selected instrument tracks from songs so one could practice them, ran a randomized playlist through it, and projected a very high-end guitar he'd analyzed for just this purpose, plugging a Bluetooth connector in as he did. He briefly felt a pang of loss for Jess's Stratocaster, but set that aside as he started to play, beginning with McCartney and Clapton's version of "While My Guitar Gently Weeps." Without realizing it, however, he fell into one of Jess's bad habits, completely losing himself in the music to the point he didn't register anything else. So he didn't realize when he was no longer alone. Toru had left home early to get away from her parents' worrying. They'd almost pulled her out of school after her close call, but she'd managed to convince them not to. She'd signed up for this, she'd known intellectually, at least, that she could lose her life if she became a hero, and her family needed to remember that as well. True, she'd been faced with her mortality far too quickly for anyone's liking, and she'd be lying if she said it hadn't shaken her, but she'd had a lot of time to think while she was recovering, and in the end she'd decided to keep going in spite of her fears and worries. Still, even though her parents had relented, that didn't change the fact that they kept hovering and practically smothering her. It made leaving home to head to school almost a relief. Arriving at the door to her classroom she was surprised to hear music coming from within. She'd fully expected to be the first there. Carefully opening the door she peeked in to see who it was. The sight of Midoriya Izuku sitting at his desk and playing an electric guitar with obvious skill greeted her surprised eyes, making her heart start hammering in her chest and her face heat up. She remembered clearly his defense of her, even through the haze of pain she'd been in at the time. The way he'd unflinchingly taken hits meant for her, blows that would have killed her and the vast majority of her classmates and even the teachers with ease. The determination in his gaze, the fury. The way he'd been forced to kill, for the sake of her and the others. The way he'd immediately began tending to her once the immediate threat had passed, not even seeming to realize he was also severely injured. Really, was it any surprise that just the sight of him had her in such a state? Carefully closing the door behind her after entering she silently made her way to her seat, using all the practice she'd put into her stealth skills, not wanting to interrupt him. She set her bag on the floor and sat down to watch him play, an unseen smile on her face as she simply enjoyed the performance. Izuku, for his part, didn't notice his new audience, completely focused on his playing. He seamlessly flowed from the song he was playing to audios, like a stone, followed by, "And So It Went," by the Pretty Reckless and then Bad Religions, "I Want to Conquer the World." He sported a content smile the entire time, not once opening his eyes, completely lost in the music even as the rest of the class began to arrive. Much like Hagakure had the rest of Class 1A peeked in before entering to find out the source of the music. Most wanted to loudly and enthusiastically greet the invisible girl when they spotted her, but she managed to keep them quiet through frantic body motions, so instead they silently patted and hugged her as they walked in, unwilling to interrupt Izuku's playing, considering how good he was, simply settling in to listen as well. When Jiro arrived, she was more than taken aback as Izuku played The Trooper by Iron Maiden. She just stood in the doorway for nearly a minute, staring with a slack jaw, before making her way to her seat to watch as well, eyes locked on the way his fingers expertly strummed the strings, showing more skill than she thought she likely had. She felt a brief surge of jealousy and competitiveness before setting them aside to listen to the music. By the time Izuku had gone through Dragon Forces, Valley of the Damned, and the Old Gods of Asgard's Take Control, the entire class had arrived, all of them sitting silently and listening to the music. Even Bakugo hadn't made a sound, sitting in his chair with his arms folded and resolutely facing away from the greenette, though he was unable to keep his head from bouncing as he listened. This was his type of music, after all. As the last growled lyric of Take Control faded, Izuku let out a breath, feeling more relaxed than he had in a while. Of course, the moment ended when the classroom filled with applause, making him jump slightly in surprise, his eyes opening to take in his classmates showing their appreciation for his skills. "That was amazing, man," Hiroshima said with a toothy smile. "How are you so good at everything? It's not fair," Ashido said with a smile of her own as she clapped. Mineta was muttering about Izuku being too damn perfect, obviously jealous of the attention even as he clapped as well. Izuku blushed and let the guitar fade away as he rubbed the back of his head. "Thanks, everyone." At that point the door opened to admit Aizawa. His arms were bound in slings, but beyond that he didn't look all that worse for wear, no doubt owing to Recovery Girl's expertise. "All right, settle down. Aizawa-sensei, are you all right?" Iida asked, concerned. "Shouldn't you be resting?" Aizawa grunted as he took his place where he usually did. "I won't be doing anything physically demanding, and there are still some things we need to go over during this homeroom in light of what happened last week." He gazed around at his students, who were all watching him. "You all acquitted yourselves well during the attack, but you shouldn't have been put in that position in the first place. Because of this, Hound Dog has set aside time to talk to each of you regarding your experiences. This is not mandatory, but highly encouraged, as a sound mind is as important as a sound body for a hero, so see me after class to make an appointment." As the students nodded, some looking thoughtful, the pro-hero turned his gaze to two students in particular. "Hagakure, Midoriya, a session with Hound Dog is mandatory for each of you." Izuku nodded in understanding. No doubt the teachers were concerned about his mental state since he was the only one to have taken lethal action during the entire event. Nezu likely wouldn't have bothered trying to stop it, since it would be best to reassure the staff that Izuku was alright. Hagakure made sense as well. She was the most severely injured of the students, so it wouldn't be surprising if there was some lingering trauma from the experience. Next, several alterations and improvements have been suggested for the costumes of the majority of you," he said, motioning to a stack of folders resting on his desk, which Ojiro quickly picked up and started hounding out, as Aizawa couldn't do so himself. "Review them and either approve or reject them as soon as possible so the changes can be made. If you have any questions, direct them to Midoriya, as he was the one to come up with most of them." "Sensei," Izuku protested, having not wanted his involvement to be made known, only to be met with a glare from his teacher as his classmates looked at him in surprise. "Your desire for anonymity in this is illogical, Midoriya," he said sternly. "Your classmates need to know who worked on their costumes so they can come to you with any issues they may have or changes they may need. They could go to the support department, but as they're your designs, then you're the person most qualified to take any alterations into account." Izuku clenched his jaw but subsided, as the pro-hero had a point, as much as he may dislike it. Bakugo, for his part, had been studying the changes to his costume with interest till he heard that Izuku had come up with them. His pride and refusal to accept help from Deku warred with his practicality and the fact that the alterations were really good, leaving him stuck in a bit of a mental loop. The main alterations to his costume were in his gauntlets, which were reinforced and had steam emitters near the palms to make him sweat more heavily, thus increasing the power of his explosions, though there were other, more minor enhancements throughout the rest of the outfit. Once that little issue was resolved, Aizawa continued with what he intended to say. Now, the last order of business is the fact that the UA Sports Festival will be starting in 3 weeks. This will be your opportunity to get the attention of pros for potential internships, so I don't think I need to explain to you how important it is that you do your best to prepare for it. Zero raised a hand. Sensei, is continuing with that really the best option considering what just happened? The school needs to show that we aren't going to let the villains disrupt our lives. Aizawa said seriously. I don't doubt you've all seen the media's reactions to the entire event. We will be increasing security by an order of magnitude, however, including bringing in pro heroes to keep an eye on things. The odds of the villains trying anything again so soon, especially after the defeat they suffered the last time they were here, is minimal. The teacher looked from one student to the next seriously. We are taking your safety extremely seriously, but we won't allow recent events to get in the way of your education and future careers. The students nodded, looking reassured, making Aizawa grunt in satisfaction. Good. That'll be all for this homeroom. With that he left, no doubt heading back to the nurse's office. As he left, most of the class quickly got up and approached Izuku, asking him questions about the costume alterations he came up with or whether he'd be continuing to train them since the sports festival was coming up. Izuku held up his hands as he was crowded by his classmates. Hold on. How about I set aside some time with each of you individually so we can discuss the costumes? Sure thing. I'm really excited by the anchoring plates, man. Hiroshima exclaimed with a toothy grin. How about the training, though? Well, I don't see why we can't continue having the martial arts lessons if you all want to, he said with a smile. As the teens celebrated and began making plans, Izuku sat back with a smile, going through lesson plans in his mind, knowing he'd have a lot of work to do to prepare the others not only for the festival but everything that would undoubtedly come after. The day passed peacefully after that. During lunch the teens had talked about how excited they were for the festival, with Uraraka being especially fired up. Of course, after hearing about her reasons for becoming a hero, he could see where her drive came from. He couldn't fault her motivations at all, and became more determined to help her and the rest of his friends succeed. Now, however, at the end of the day, he sat in Hound Dog's office, the school counselor staring at him surprisingly calmly considering his reputation and known personality, both of them silent for the moment, studying each other. I'm sure you know why you're here. The pro hero growled. You and the rest of the staff want to make sure I'm mentally sound after I was forced to kill Nomu in the USJ. Izuku replied calmly. Hound Dog nodded, growling slightly in anger at the reminder of the incident before he refocused. You appear quite calm. His tone was neutral, not indicating whether he considered that a good thing or not. Izuku let out a breath and closed his eyes, considering how to deal with this in a way that wouldn't have the entire staff thinking he was some kind of psychopath. I'm not happy that I had to kill him in the USJ, Hound Dog Sensei. He began. I had nightmares and other trouble sleeping that night. All perfectly true. For all of his experience and memories, that had been his first time taking a life as Izuku, and he wasn't ashamed to say he'd wept a bit over the loss of some of whatever innocence he had left. But I don't regret doing what I had to do to keep everyone else alive. There was no guarantee I could have held it off till All Might arrived without it killing someone, or even that All Might would have been able to beat a weapon specifically designed to kill him. He opened his eyes and gazed at Hound Dog steadily. Everyone that knows me has always been aware I'm the biggest hero fanboy in Japan. I've been mocked about that often enough. But that means I'm very aware of the times that heroes have been forced to take lethal action. Gang Orca with the Spangler brothers. Yoroi Musha with Steel Calamity. Celadon Star with Karoi Kasu, Izuku sighed, closing his eyes again. I've always known I might eventually have to take a life to protect others. I just didn't expect it to be so soon. The room was silent for a few moments as Hound Dog processed Izuku's words. It seems you've thought things through more than most kids do when they first come here. He said slowly. I'm well aware that life is rarely as kind as hero manga and the like make it seem. Izuku said softly, almost mournfully. Hound Dog wasn't sure what to make of this. He could tell that Izuku was being mostly sincere, but he was still taking things a bit too well for his comfort. It was one thing to intellectually know that one might have to take a life, it was an entirely different thing to experience it. He would have much preferred having a session with the Greenette the day after the USJ was attacked, but the entire staff had been going nuts trying to deal with the aftermath and plug any further holes in security, so it had been pushed to the side till things had somewhat calmed down. As it was, the pro made a note on his laptop regarding the boy's far too calm attitude about the situation. He'd need to bring it up with Nezu, who had hinted that Midoriya might be abnormal. "Run me through your thought process at the time," he said, growled. Izuku thought back, letting the words come out without really filtering them, explaining the realization of Nomu's multiple quirks, how they made it pretty much unstoppable to non-lethal, and even lethal, means, how every moment increased the chance of Hagakure or someone else dying, how the threat needed to be eliminated permanently, and the only real way he'd thought of to do that. Hound Dog noted everything down, looking for any fallacies in the reasoning or indications that Midoriya might be unstable to have considered such in the first place, but overall found a line of thinking to match what a smart, experienced pro would in such a situation. Which was, in and of itself, strange. He was missing something, he knew it, but he couldn't come up with what, and the session ended with Midoriya being cleared to continue his studies at UA while Hound Dog decided to do some digging. The next afternoon found the majority of the first-year students back at Yaoyorozu's home, going through another martial arts lesson, having unanimously decided to increase the amount per week in order to best prepare for the sports festival. Seeing as they all wanted to discuss their costumes as well, however, Izuku started them all off before handing them off to Kendo and Ojiro's supervision while he called the students aside one at a time in order to do so. He had gotten through half of the students that wanted to speak to him so far, and had called Yaoyorozu to the room he'd set aside for the discussions next. He could have had the discussions in the dojo so he could keep an eye on the lesson, but not only did he not want to disrupt the class any more than he already was, he very specifically wanted to keep his conversation with the beautiful heiress from anybody's hearing. As the girl entered the room with a smile, closing the door behind her, she took a seat across from Izuku at the small table covered in notes and diagrams which he'd been occupying. "Thank you for the lessons and your work on our costumes, Midoriya-kun. I'm sure everyone appreciates it. I know I do, though I am a bit confused as to what you came up with." She began as she sat primly, observing him. "I figured you would, out of everyone," Izuku said as he made some notes. "I take it the fact that the costume I came up with for you is a full bodysuit is what has you a bit puzzled?" he asked with a smile. Yaoyorozu nodded. "Yes, I don't see how it is practical, considering my quirk. There is a reason my current costume has the openings it does, and it's not because I'm an exhibitionist, regardless of what some might say," she said with a small blush. "I understand," Izuku said soothingly before picking up a bag that was resting next to the table. "I think the best way to make things clear is to just have you try it out yourself. I have here a prototype of your new costume. Would you be so kind as to try it on?" Yaoyorozu nodded as she got up and took the bag, moving to a door nearby that led into a small, by her standards, closet, assuming that is where he'd meant for her to change. Izuku continued working on revisions and notes while he waited for his vice representative to come out, making adjustments to various costumes based on feedback from the teens he'd already spoken to. Soon enough, however, the door to the closet opened, prompting him to turn to look at his hostess. Yaoyorozu was clad in a tight-fitting bodysuit that clung to her and gave a good impression of her body, though it overall wasn't any more revealing than a normal one-piece swimsuit or the costumes of the likes of Uraraka or Tsuyu. And it was definitely less overall than her current costume, which he knew some of the boys might complain about. It was a single solid reddish color, similar to her current costume, but that could be changed in later iterations. This one had just been made as proof of concept that it would work with her quirk. The shapely girl twisted and turned in the outfit, not seeming to consider how her actions highlighted her body, Izuku doing his best to focus on how it fit her and if any changes needed to be made rather than the fuel he was getting for his teenage fantasies. "How does it feel?" Yaoyorozu considered the question as she continued moving to try it out. "Different. The material feels rather odd compared to anything else I've worn, but it's comfortable and very easy to move around in. Izuku nodded, pleased. It matched his own experience wearing unstable molecule suits. Good. Now then, how about you make something as a test? Anywhere on your body that's covered by the outfit, please. Yaoyorozu frowned slightly but did so, pulling her preferred bow staff out of her upper arm before setting it aside. She glanced at the place it had come out from, fully expecting to find a hole in the suit, but blinked as unmarked fabric met her gaze. What? She gasped, before quickly making a Matryoshka doll on her other arm and then a solid steel shield from her stomach area, watching as the objects appeared as though she wasn't wearing anything, the outfit remaining intact. As the shield clanged onto the floor, she brushed a hand against her belly, finding only seemingly untouched fabric. She looked up at Izuku, who was taking notes with a smile on his face. Excellent, he said with satisfaction. That's about how I expected it to go, but it's good to have independent confirmation. He looked back up at Yaoyorozu and motioned for her to sit back down. I'm sure you have questions, and I'd be happy to explain how the outfit works some other time, but we've got a few other things we need to talk about. Yaoyorozu slowly made her way to the chair and sat down, gazing at Izuku with an evaluating look. I'll hold you to that, Midoriya-kun. What else did you need to discuss, though? Izuku took a couple of sheets of paper out of his bag and set them in front of her, revealing them to be the molecular structures of two substances she'd never encountered before. After a few moments of study, she could deduce the first was a steel alloy of a complexity she hadn't expected, and though she couldn't tell its exact properties just with a single glance, something niggled at her about it. The other, however, was entirely alien to her, and one of the most complex structures she'd ever seen. She studied it with interest, beginning to memorize it out of habit, and she only realized how deep she'd fallen into her analysis of it when Izuku cleared his throat loudly to get her attention, making her jump and look up at him with an embarrassed blush on her cheeks. Sorry. She glanced back down at the papers. What are these? The first is a steel alloy called true adamantium, he said, tapping the paper with it as he spoke. Knowing the girl's sheer intelligence, he explained its properties as Peter would have to a fellow scientist, and he could see her eyes grow wide the more she heard about it. That's amazing, she said as he finished, staring at the adamantium paper with awe. The uses for such an alloy are immense. Izuku nodded with a smile. I've given Nezu-sensei the formula for it, and he's shopping it around with people he trusts, including specialists on Island. Then his face became very serious. The second one, however, is the reason I want you to be very, very careful. Momo felt a shiver go along her spine. What is it? She asked quietly, able to sense how serious the boy she'd grown to respect so much over the last few weeks was about this. It's called vibranium, he said quietly, as though fearful of being overheard, and then he explained its properties and its potential. If Momo had been astounded by adamantium, then what her class representative was telling her that this material could do made her feel faint. She stared at the innocent-seeming piece of paper with its molecular structure with both awe and fear. Once he finished, she swallowed and looked up at him. Where did you learn of this? Izuku was silent for a moment, gazing at her seriously. I can't tell you now. We haven't known each other for long enough. It's not that I don't trust you, it's just that unbelievable. He smiled gently. I will tell you someday, I promise. What's more important, right now, is what you're going to do with this knowledge. What do you mean? She asked, her mouth suddenly rather dry. As far as I and Nezu-sensei are aware, there is no vibranium in existence on Earth at this time. He said slowly, prompting the very obvious question in her mind as to how he was aware not only of its existence but also its molecular structure if that was the case. As such, until we find someone with a similar quirk as yours, or develop a Star Trek-style matter replicator, you are the only potential source of the ore on the planet. He didn't say any more, he didn't need to. Yaoyorozu was perfectly capable of grasping the implications. She turned her gaze back to the paper with the molecular structure of vibranium, her face pale even as she felt a headache start to form. If it became public knowledge that she could create a material such as this, then why? She began, licking her dry lips as she tried to verbalize the very obvious question. Because it's too useful to not at least consider the possibility. He said gently. The potential uses of even small amounts. He let out a sigh. I would ask that, even if you decide you never want anything to do with it ever again, you would give me some to use, but in the end it's your choice. Can I think about it? She asked softly. Izuku nodded immediately as he took hold of the paper holding the vibranium formula, putting it away, while leaving the adamantium paper on the table for her. Of course. Feel free to skip the rest of the lesson to think. I doubt you'd be able to focus anyway. Maybe discuss it with Nezu-sensei tomorrow as well. Momo nodded and stood up somewhat woodenly, taking the adamantium formula with her as she left without another word. She had a lot to think about. As he watched the girl leave, Izuku sighed tiredly, feeling bad about dumping this on Yaoyorozu's shoulders, but set that aside as he called his next classmate in to continue the work on the costumes. There was still a lot of work to do to prepare for the storm his instincts and experience told him was approaching. Gods, sometimes being a hero really ed. Izuku leaned back in his seat as the final school day before the sports festival ended. The training of his classmates had been going well for the last few weeks, with his martial arts lessons occurring nearly every day, and from what he knew the others were training their own skills and quirks very frequently on their own as well. They had all been showing marked improvements in their fighting skills and the usage of their quirks in combination with them on those times he dedicated a class to making sure they could integrate them well. The costume discussions had gone nicely as well, even if they wouldn't be of much use during the sports festival itself. He had indeed made changes to several of them based on feedback by the people that would actually be wearing them, and while speaking with the students about them he had also discussed potential new ways to utilize their quirks, which had expanded their repertoire nicely. Indeed, everything was going pretty well, and Izuku was sure that his classmates were more than prepared for the upcoming festival, including Bakugo and Todoroki, even though they weren't members of the class he taught. From what he knew of them he couldn't imagine them slacking off or not giving it their all. The only real problem Izuku was having at the moment was coming up with what he was going to say for the pledge he was supposed to give for the sports festival, being the one that came first place in the entrance exam. None of his past lives were what he would call great public speakers, though Jesse and Peter had some decent experience with doing so when necessary. And the less said about Izuku himself prior to receiving the memories, the better. Going through and discarding ideas as he got up and picked up his bag, he was mildly surprised when he heard Bakugo bark at someone standing outside. Glancing out he saw a large mass of students gathered outside of the room, many with confrontational looks on their faces. None of them were heroic students, unless they were upperclassmen that Izuku didn't know, though that possibility went out the window when the boy in the lead, with tired-seeming eyes and gravity-defying indigo hair, said he was from Gen Ed. Izuku hung back, listening to the discussion and keeping an eye out in case he needed to intervene, since Bakugo was predictably increasing the hostility level with his abrasive personality. He reminded himself that he really needed to find some way to shock the blonde out of the complexes their upbringing gave him. Izuku had been a teacher as Peter and Ranma, and he could see exactly how the way society had enabled Bakugo had really screwed the boy up. In spite of everything, including his changes, a part of Izuku wanted to help the other boy become a better person. He didn't want to believe he was a lost cause. That didn't mean he was going to put up with any of the explosive teen's shit, however, as he'd already aptly demonstrated. There was a difference between trying to help him improve and becoming a doormat again. His attention was drawn when the perpled mentioned having originally aimed for heroics but being unable to get in due to the way the entrance exam was set up. When he gave Bakugo his declaration of war to bump one of them from a spot he could take, Izuku smiled, pleased by how fortune had smiled on him. He knew what he was going to say. The day of the sports festival had arrived, and the stadium the first year's events would be held in was packed to capacity, far more than was normal. Most years the focus was on the third years, as they were more experienced and skilled, and thus more entertaining. This year, however, everyone wanted to see the students that had fought off a villain attack within a week of starting to attend UA. The press in particular was eager for any new drama to use. The various classes had their own waiting rooms, and Izuku leaned against a wall in one aze as he watched his classmates psych themselves up or in conversation to deal with their nerves. His attention was drawn when Todoroki approached him, a serious look on his face, an almost glare in his eyes. "Can I help you, Todoroki-kun? I believe it's safe to say that you're the strongest person in this class, Midoriya," Todoroki said, seeming unhappy to be forced to admit as much. Izuku raised an eyebrow as his classmates all stopped any conversations they were having to pay attention, Bakugo looking especially aggrieved at Todoroki's assessment. "Perhaps in some aspects, but we all have our strengths, Todoroki. I've seen you around campus, talking to All Might," he said, making Izuku frown. They hadn't been hiding their connection, exactly, but they weren't advertising it either. All Might had indeed pulled him aside a few times, sometimes to ask for teaching advice, sometimes simply to talk, interested in his previous lives, or any insights he could give on certain situations due to his unorthodox viewpoint. Nezu had done the same, once or twice, though he was obviously quite busy and thus could make as much time to do so. He refocused when Todoroki continued. "He has his eye on you, and that simply motivates me further. I am going to defeat you and be the winner of this event," the dual-toned boy said coldly. Kirishima approached. "Whoa, a declaration of war against our class rep, huh?" he said with a grin. "That's manly as hell. But you don't need to be so intense about it," he said as he reached out to pat Todoroki's shoulder, only to be shrugged off. "I'm not here to make friends," Todoroki said harshly. "I'm here to prove myself to," he hesitated before continuing, "to everyone." Everyone was staring at Todoroki for a moment before Izuku spoke, breaking the silence of the moment. "I welcome your challenge, Todoroki, but I advise you be careful," he said lightly, though his eyes were sharp. "Don't tunnel on me and be caught off guard by our schoolmates. I've trained with all of these people, and I can guarantee any of them could give you a nasty surprise, especially if you underestimate them, to say nothing of students in courses like Gen Ed. For all you know they have a quirk that's a perfect counter to yours and it's just not effective against robots." He pushed away from the wall and gazed into Todoroki's eyes with a steely gaze. "Everyone here is aiming for the top, and everyone is going to give it their all. Dismiss them at your own risk." He smiled, then, and it was surprisingly sharp. "That includes me, of course." The room was silent for a moment as all the students stared at the tableau of Izuku and Todoroki staring each other down. Then the moment ended when Kirishima whispered, "Manly," and the signal for them all to head out onto the arena came over the speakers. With that, Izuku and Yaoyorozu gathered the teens together before leading them out of the waiting room, everyone doing their best to steel themselves for what was to come. They emerged to the roar of cheering crowds that nearly drowned out the sound of present mic presenting them, and Izuku didn't need to look to know that some of his classmates were getting increasingly nervous at seeing just how many people would be watching them compete. He wondered how many just now realized they'd be on TV as well. They stood near the podium that had been set up for whoever would be officiating as the rest of the first years emerged, the 1B students getting similar cheers to 1A's due to being part of the USJ incident as well, which Izuku considered to be a good thing. He'd hate to think of their sister class being shafted due to circumstance, even if such circumstances had been negative. The general studies, support and management got a notably more subdued response, which Izuku could see was irritating to several of them, a sad consequence of current society's focus on heroics. Once all the students were gathered, Midnight stepped out onto the podium, her hips swaying tantalizingly, making more than one spectator sit up more attentively, everybody that was interested in women suddenly much more excited to be spectating the first years. Izuku couldn't help but chuckle at the reaction of all these people at the sight of the beautiful woman. Mineta was practically vibrating in place. "It's now time for the athlete's oath," Midnight declared with a crack of her flogger. The student representative is Midoriya Izuku, from Class 1A. As Izuku began to walk towards the podium, hiding his nerves by pulling on Jesse and Peter's memories like a cloak, he heard non-heroics students mutter angrily about him only getting it because he had come first in the heroics exam. He agreed with them that it wasn't fair, but he couldn't exactly do anything about it at the moment, so put it out of his mind as he took his place on the podium. Briefly boggling at the absurdity that UA allowed too much leeway in what the student representative said in this situation, he gathered the thoughts he had come up with, wanting to say something memorable and inspiring to all his schoolmates, not just the ones in the heroics course. As an athlete's pledge, he began, as the stadium quieted down in order to allow him to speak. I vow we will reach out to grasp the outcome we seek, whether that involves heroics, support, management, or something else. He raised a hand and clenched it into a fist. No matter how remote the possibility, behind how many zeros it might be, the only time the goal we set ourselves is impossible is when we give up. It doesn't matter what background we come from. His eyes briefly met Uraraka's, who smiled back with soft eyes. What setbacks we have encountered. His gaze turned to the indigo-haired boys, who seemed startled when he realized that he was being addressed directly. Or who pettily stands in our way. This time he looked at Bakugo defiantly, the blonde's eyes narrowing angrily as he scowled. We will seize the future we want with our own two hands, no matter how far beyond the radix point it is. With that he lowered his fist and began stepping off the podium, the stadium silent for a moment before erupting into applause and cheering. His fellow students clapped as well, even the non-heroic students appearing to be buoyed by his words, small smiles on their faces just from the fact that he'd thought to include them as well. Midnight stepped back up to the spot Izuku had just vacated, a smirk on her face as she eyed Izuku as he walked away, licking her lips lightly. Well then, with that stimulating declaration, let's move on to the first event. She turned to look at the holographic display that appeared behind her, which began cycling through different event options before finally stopping at one. This year's fateful event is going to be the obstacle course race. The students around Izuku began murmuring amongst each other, making plans and trying to shake off their nerves before Midnight continued. This'll be a race between every member of all 11 classes, with the course being a 4-kilometer lap around the stadium itself. The smirk on her beautiful face widened. Our school preaches freedom in all things, so as long as you don't go off the course, anything is fair game. She cracked her whip once again. Racers, to your positions. The students all gathered by the indicated gate, preparing themselves physically and mentally. Izuku stayed at the back of the mass, right in front of the management students, who didn't look too enthused for the event, and stretched himself, getting ready for the run. He was going to let the other students go first, already able to see the bottleneck that the relatively narrow corridor would create. Midnight cracked her flogger once again with greater force, a large, sadistic grin on her face. Start. All Might sat with his colleagues in the teacher's booth, watching the race begin with interest. He'd made sure to attend in his skinny form, not wanting to draw attention away from the students, not to mention he doubted his time limit would be long enough to last the entire festival. As the mass of students became jammed in the starting gate, he noticed Izuku walking calmly behind them as the management students moved away to watch the rest of the racers and make business simulations, having nothing to directly gain from competing. He was unhurried in his pace, relaxedly stretching as he did so, drawing the attention of the audience, who began to murmur in confusion. "What's Midoriya doing?" Present Mike asked, being the announcer and commentator for the festival. Was all that talk about grasping all possibilities just hot air? A lot of his classmates have reached the Robo Inferno barrier. Don't be an idiot, Aizawa said gruffly, having been dragged into being Mike's co-MC due to his injuries. He insisted he was entirely healed, but his coworkers were still concerned for him, Mike and Midnight especially, so he agreed to not do his usual festival prep work and commentate instead, no matter how much it irritated him. Midoriya is patient, smart, and unconventional. He's got something planned. Even as Aizawa finished speaking, Izuku cracked his neck and crouched down in preparation. The next thing anybody knew, he was soaring above the mass of students still stuck in the gate's bottleneck, his feet landing on the wall and sticking there as he began to run along it above the stuck students, avoiding them completely and landing on the other side in seconds. By the time 2 of the zero-pointers had collapsed due to Todoroki freezing them over, he had already almost reached them, legs pumping rhythmically as he ran with his body low to the ground, service weapon in hand to deal with any hostile obstacles. A one-pointer moved to get in his way and was promptly decapitated by an expertly placed shot to the head, Izuku barely even seeming conscious of having done so as he used his abilities to perform such a quick dash between a zero-pointer's legs it seemed like he'd teleported. Well, He's definitely grabbed people's attention," Snipe said as he sat back in his seat, his arms crossed. "I think that was the point," Power Loader said as he munched on some popcorn. "I've spent time in the workshop with that kid. I'd say he's nearly as smart as Nezu." By hanging back so casually, he didn't only avoid the crush of students trying to get through the gate, he also drew everyone's eyes. All Might nodded. Indeed, Midoriya apparently remembered that part of the point of the sports festival is to draw the interest of potential internship sponsors. A smart yet attention-grabbing play will do so, especially when he comes from behind and takes first place. "I notice that you don't seem to doubt that Midoriya will come in first," 13 commented, fiddling with the bottle of water in her hand. "And that you don't call him young Midoriya unless around other students now." Her tone was conversational, but the question in it was still obvious. "I do have a personal connection to Midoriya, but I assure you that I am not allowing it to influence my judgment or give him preferential treatment," All Might admitted mildly as he watched Izuku reach the pit obstacle, not pausing for an instant, simply leaping across the chasm with ease and a bit of help from his levitation power, reaching the other side in seconds and being within sight of Bakugo and Todoroki, who were in the lead. "I don't need to, as his skills and abilities speak for themselves. I would say that if it weren't for government requirements and his desire to have a relatively normal high school experience, he could be a top-ranking pro already. His performance at the USJ was certainly impressive, if unfortunate," Smintos admitted, drawing unhappy shuffling from 13 at the reminder. "Sorry, Anon," he said afterwards, regretting upsetting her, 13 waving the apology away with a, "No problem." His thought process during the confrontation with Nomu was that of an experienced pro. Hound Dog growled, which is unusual. All Might did his best to ignore the suspicious glare the animalistic guidance counselor was sending him, though he was unable to avoid sweating a bit. "There's also the fact that he's been teaching most of his classmates martial arts," Ectoplasm added, "and not just 1A, either, but 1B as well. It's too soon to see any real improvement from that, if any, but just the fact that he's doing so and willing to include the sister class says something about him. He's a genius inventor too," Power Loader said as he chased down his popcorn with some soda. "Some of the things he's made are ingenious, and he's always willing to help any of the support students, though it's mostly Hatsume, who is always doing something extra and is a bit reckless. Is it just me, or is he perhaps a bit too perfect?" Vlad King asked gruffly, eyes narrowed in suspicion as he watched Izuku overtake Todoroki and Bakugo at the minefield, dashing telekinetically through it, barely touching the ground for a second before dashing again, thus either not setting off the mines or getting away from any explosions before they went off, essentially ignoring them. As Izuku ran through the gate back into the stadium, not seeming to be winded in the least, the teachers all turned to stare pointedly at All Might, who kept his gaze focused on Izuku and the rest of the students that were arriving, pointedly not noticing their piercing gaze, though he couldn't hide the sweat beading his emaciated face. In a certain rundown bar in a certain city, Shigaraki Tamura scratched at his neck as he watched the UA Sports Festival on television, his gaze locked on the greenette that had come in first. "So, that is the boy that killed our Nomu," his sensei said from a screen nearby, apparently watching the festival as well. "He's certainly made an impression. When are we going to kill him, sensei?" Shigaraki asked. "I want him dead after how he humiliated us at USJ." "Patience, Shigaraki," sensei said soothingly. "That time will come, but for the moment I want to study him. His abilities don't make sense. His quirk registry superficially explains the eccentricities, but something about this rubs me the wrong way." Shigaraki turned from the screen showing the festival to focus on his teacher. "You think he's like you?" he asked, apparently mulling over that possibility. "Perhaps. Either way, I want to find out more, and perhaps acquire those abilities for myself," sensei said mildly. "And after you take his quirk, I'll kill him," Shigaraki said eagerly. "Of course," all for one said in agreement, a smile on his unseen face. As the rest of the teens began arriving at the finish line, gathering in a clump near the podium Midnight stood on, 3 of the pro heroes working security were watching from a television in one of the break rooms. Death Arms sat back as he smoked a cigarette where he couldn't be seen by anyone that might make his sponsors upset. Looks like this group didn't survive USJ on a fluke. He said once he'd let out a breath of smoke, much to Kamui Woods and Mount Lady's annoyance, considering they were in said smoke's path. Especially that first place kid. Went in last, came out first, and made it look easy. That's the sort of showmanship and skill that'll get plenty of internship offers. Mount Lady munched on some dango she'd convinced a stall vendor to give her, watching the television idly. He looks familiar. Kamui Woods leaned back in his seat with his arms crossed as he watched the television as well. Same here, he thought about it for a few moments before making a sound of realization. Oh, now I remember. The sludge villain incident last year. He was the kid that rushed in to try to save the hostage. Mount Lady blinked and paused in her chewing, turning her gaze from Kamui back to the screen, which happened to be showing all the students that had managed to qualify, the cameras catching how most of the heroic students were gathered around the boy they were discussing, laughing and congratulating each other, the green-haired teen smiling as he patted the shoulder of a girl with horns. Seriously, how does a kid go from almost getting killed while desperately clawing at a bunch of slime to showing these kinds of skills? I know Ua is supposed to be good, but there's no way it's this good. Death Arms took another puff of his cig, his own brow furrowed. You've got a point. If he had a quirk that potent then he should have used it back then. I would have been less pissed at him if he'd at least showed he wasn't trying to commit suicide by villain. The conversation was interrupted when Midnight began to announce what the next event would be, followed by the rules. When it was announced that first place in the race would be worth 1,000,000 points in the upcoming cavalry battle, Kamui Woods raised an eyebrow, not that many people could tell. Wonder how he'll do now that most people won't want to work with him due to the target on his back. When Midnight gave the students leave to start forming teams, however, he and the rest of the pros watching were caught by surprise. Wait, what's going on? This isn't how it usually goes, Present Mike commentated as he watched most of those who had qualified swarm Midoriya, asking to be on his team, only a few staying away from the group. Aizawa could be heard sighing in exasperation. You really need to be more observant and keep on top of class dynamics, Mike. He said before expounding on his statement, blatantly ignoring Mike's offended, "Hey." Midoriya has established himself as strong, reliable, and intelligent. He is the undisputed leader of the first-year heroic students, and not just because he's class representative for 1A. He has had a hand in modifying their costumes to best take advantage of their abilities, displayed his skill and power during the USJ incident, and has been teaching most of the rest of the students martial arts after school. While nothing is guaranteed, I would imagine that his schoolmates consider working with him a better bet than working against him. That's so cool, Hato Najire exclaimed as she watched the first year's events with her fellow members of UA's Big Three. I knew he had to be nice. Everybody really wants to be on his team. I wonder how strong he is. Is he fast? Can he leap tall buildings in a single bound? Ooh, who would win if they fought, him or Mirio-kun? Mirio laughed at the questions. I don't know, but it sounds like it would be interesting to find out. He said with a grin. The blonde glanced over at the last but certainly not least member of the Big Three. What do you think, Tamaki-kun? He could probably win easily if he used that power from the time the press invaded. The shy, anxious teen known as Amajiki Tamaki said in response, shivering at the memory of feeling like some higher power was deciding whether he was worth the effort to squash. I don't think he will. Najire said, I mean, it's not really nice to use it if he doesn't have to. She brought a finger to her chin in thought as the teams on screen finished assembling. I wonder how being able to stick to walls and float are going to help though. Well, we don't know that those are the only things he can do, Hato-chan. Mirio said, still smiling, though that smile dimmed at his next words. Isn't he the one that killed that Nomu thing in the USJ, after all? Najire's lips pursed at that, her cheerful face darkening a bit as Tamaki nodded. He is, the boy said quietly. Mirio crossed his arms as he studied the screen with a serious look on his face as the cavalry battle began. Sir looked into that. I don't know exactly what he found out, but he was out of sorts for about a week afterwards. Tamaki and Najire glanced at each other at that information, consternation on their faces. At the Titan homeless shelter, every single one of its regular residents was sitting around the television as they watched the US Sports Festival, all of them cheering Izuku on as they enjoyed the spectacle. Toga Himiko sat near the front of the audience, sipping lightly on a straw from a large thermos as she watched, her eyes riveted on Izuku each time he was focused on leading his team against the others, primarily playing defense as that majority of the other teams fought each other, though the teams led by the explosive blonde and the boy with red and white hair seemed to be focusing on him more than any others, though they apparently weren't above attacking targets of opportunity. Somehow I'm not surprised that Midoriya-kun is considered the leader of all of the first-year students. One of the older residents, a woman named Peru with hair like strands of crystal, said as she reclined on one of the comfortable seats that had been recently bought using some of the money one of said students had donated. Normally all money would go to necessities like food and clothes, but it had been a large donation, so they were able to get some more furniture without impacting necessities in any way, even managing to set some extra aside for a rainy day. I know, another resident, a large, beefy man with tusks called Butaken, said as he leaned back in his own, more conventional folding chair, his arms crossed as he smiled at the children cheering and jumping around in excitement at the displays on the television. I mean, it only seems appropriate, doesn't it? He glanced over at Himiko, who he was sitting next to. What are you drinking so happily? Himiko finished her latest sip before answering. It's a special drink Izuku got me. I've been saving it, but I thought it appropriate to drink now, she said with a happy smile on her face. Oh good, mind if I have a taste? Butaken asked, beginning to reach over only to pause when Himiko began to hold the thermos to her chest protectively, glaring at him in a way that would make it unsurprising if she started hissing like a cat. Or not, that's fine too. Their attention was drawn back to the television when the kids let out a sudden cheer at a particularly impressive play by one of the teams, making them jump up and down with excitement. That was amazing. He jumped up, and, yeah, then the pretty lady. But it wouldn't have worked without that big guy. Inunaki-san, the woman in charge of running the shelter, smiled as she sat off to the side, sipping some tea as she watched everyone enjoy the sports festival. The fact that they knew some of the people involved, and thus had an actual stake in what was happening, just made things all the more exciting for everyone there. It was always a joy to her to see the residents in high spirits, especially the younger ones. Himiko, for her part, continued sipping her drink as she kept her eyes riveted on Izuku, enjoying the coppery taste of the liquid he'd given her. In a run-down apartment in the Yamanashi prefecture, an old man was eating a plate of taiyaki while he too watched the sports festival. He was chewing as he studied the green-haired boy that was proving himself the one to watch in this event. He had decided to watch in order to study his idiot pupil's own students, to see if the buffoon was actually any good a teacher, especially as he too had heard of the USJ attack and what the objective had been. Now, however, he was focused on the boy the commentary had said was the leader of the first-year heroics course. He recognized the name from the report of the USJ incident he'd gotten from a friend in the police force. He set aside his food and grabbed said file after a bit of searching, looking at the teen's profile, including quirk registry. His eyes tightened as he considered the information, feeling a sense of unease similar to when he'd first read it. There was something up with the situation, and he didn't like it. It sounded too much like someone with multiple quirks in a superficial way to explain it, and that just rang a variety of alarms in his mind. Settling back down to continue watching, he refocused on the team that was making him uneasy, deciding to continue watching before making a decision, especially as the third round was always a tournament, which would showcase more of the boy's abilities. Still, it seemed he'd need to be getting in touch with Toshinori sooner rather than later. At the Night Eye Hero Agency, the leader of said agency was watching the sports festival with narrowed eyes, focusing on Midoriya Izuku. He had been wanting to observe this particular student for months now, so this appeared to be the perfect opportunity. He had even asked Bubble Girl and Centipeter to watch with him so he could get their opinions under the cover of wanting to determine how All Might's first class was doing. What he saw was concerning. All Might had told Night Eye quite a bit about the boy back when he had first chosen him to be the symbol of peace's successor, a decision Mirai still vehemently disagreed with, and the discrepancies with what he was seeing now had him on high alert. He glanced at his computer, where he had the boy's profile and quirk registry pulled up, and this simply didn't fit. All Might had told him that the boy was quirkless and currently rather timid if determined. The easy confidence and leadership he was displaying didn't fit his psychological profile from the time, not to mention all of his abilities. One for All should have enhanced any original quirk, true, but as the boy was supposed to be quirkless then that didn't make sense. Telekinesis, advanced combat skill, temporary item creation, surface adhesion, superhuman physical parameters, genius intellect, and that was likely just scratching the surface. One for All could not account for all of what the boy could do. Not to mention his willingness to take lethal action. To be clear, Mirai wasn't condemning the decision itself. He was a seasoned enough pro to know that sometimes it was just the kind of action that had to be taken. But the issue was that such a mentality typically only developed with experience. Yes, in UA's third year they had extensive classes on how to determine and handle the necessity of lethal force, but the boy had only been in school for a week before USJ, without any exposure to combat against villains before that outside of the sludge villain incident that was noted in his file. He could simply be a very mature teen that had been forced to grow up more quickly than most. That did happen, depressingly often, even. But when combined with all the other data Mirai had at his disposal, including what All Might had already revealed to him, the only reason he wasn't more concerned than he already was came on screen at that moment as the cameraman briefly focused on the teachers, where Mirai could see All Might in his skinny form watching the cavalry battle with a smile on his face, his hands clasped in front of his chin. The camera didn't linger on him, as nobody knew who he actually was, but it reminded Mirai that All Might did not seem alarmed by the discrepancies. As far as he could tell, All Might didn't seem concerned at all with his protégé's apparent impossibilities, which meant one of two things. The first, and obviously most likely, was that the man had access to information that his former sidekick didn't. It would make sense, as he had known Midoriya for nearly a full year, and would thus know about any details that Sir Night-Eye couldn't get his hands on. The second, and infinitely worse but quite unlikely option, was that All Might had been compromised in some way. Mirai didn't want to believe it, an instinctive aversion to the thought of his former mentor being manipulated in any way rearing its head, but he didn't deny the possibility. For all of One for All's strengths, as far as Mirai was aware, it offered no true protection from mental manipulation. And even if it did, once it had been passed on there would be no guarantee that any such protection would remain. So if All Might could be tricked into giving it to someone with malicious intent. Still, the latter option was incredibly unlikely for more reasons than him simply not wanting it to be. If something like that had happened, others would have noticed. Nezu alone would perceive it easily and have the connections to sound the alarm, most likely reaching out to Mirai himself. So unless Nezu had also been compromised, highly unlikely, then he was in on whatever information Mirai wasn't privy to. He turned his gaze back to the television when Bubble Girl began to clap with a smile on her face, finding that the cavalry battle was over. He refocused his attention now as he waited for the tournament to begin. That should give more information to use to make a decision on what to do moving forward. Izuku smiled as the students around him either cheered and congratulated each other on getting through the cavalry battle or beeped their losses somewhat good-naturedly. One thing he was very pleased with in how the cavalry battle had gone was the fact that his schoolmates mostly hadn't segregated themselves by class. Likely thanks to their experiences in the USJ and training with him, they had been more willing to mingle, so that there had been several groups made up of members of both classes. As Midnight declared that there would be a 30-minute break before the next round, his smile fell into a frown as his eyes landed on Todoroki, who was gazing down at his left hand with a look on his face that filled Izuku with unease. He recognized that look, which spoke of someone wrestling with demons. He'd seen it many times, primarily during his life as Peter. There had very rarely been a hero, or villain, for that matter, that he'd met without some sort of psychological scarring, whether they had started out that way or developed it after beginning to walk that path. Trauma was essentially an inevitability when it came to the people that got involved in the superpowered game on either side. His other lives had seen it as well, if not to as great an extent as Peter, which gave him several viewpoints to draw on. And it wasn't too hard to figure out what might have been causing it. Izuku could see the frustrated desperation on Todoroki's face as the timer ran down the last few seconds. While not above taking out targets of opportunity that wandered too close, the elemental teen had been incredibly focused on taking the 1,000,000 points from Izuku, even when his teammates had urged him to be more careful. It was as though he wouldn't consider it a proper victory unless he defeated Izuku, or at least, came in uncontested first place. An attitude that reminded the Greenette of Bakugo, who was also doggedly trying to get the 1,000,000 from him. So when Iida had used his Recipro burst, Izuku had been ready. He could see frost appear on Todoroki's right arm, likely as an attempt to freeze him in place at least long enough to take the headband. Iida, no fool, was dashing towards Izuku's own right to allow Todoroki to best use his quirk. With a quick murmur to his mounts to keep running, the two groups dashed at each other like jousting knights. It was as Todoroki was reaching out, ice forming into a sort of claw, that Izuku leapt off his mounts, jumping to Todoroki's other side in order to attack from his left, since he never used his quirk from that side. True, if he touched the ground he'd lose, but that wasn't a concern. He was a master of aerial combat when combining Peter, Ranma and Jess's skills, after all, with more than a few advantages added thanks to Shuru. The surprise on Todoroki's face as Izuku's fist raced for his face disappeared from the Greenette's sight in a burst of intense flames. Considering the shocked breath his sensitive ears heard Todoroki draw, he knew it had been an instinctual, unplanned reaction. Any further methods of attack that would make it through the flames the other teen was emitting were too dangerous, more so for Todoroki than himself, so Izuku pulled back. A dagger materialized under his foot, giving him enough leverage to kick off of, and he launched himself back to his mounts without coming within a foot of the ground. He could hear the crowds cheer at the move as he landed, but his attention was immediately drawn by Bakugo's incoming attack. Todoroki had once bluntly stated that he'd never use his fire in combat, and whatever was behind that decision was obviously shaken by his instinctual use of the flames to protect himself. Izuku could think of several reasons for that decision and attitude, very few not worrying in some way, but he needed more information. When Todoroki moved to follow the other students out of the stadium for the announced break, he was stopped when Izuku's hand landed on his shoulder. "I think we need to have a conversation, Todoroki-kun." Todoroki turned to him with a frown. "Where's Midoriya-kun?" he heard one of the 1B extras ask as they headed to the small cafeteria lunch Rush had set up for the participating students. He mentioned he had something he needed to talk to Todoroki about before he could eat. One of the ones from his own class said, making him pause. "Really? Wonder what it is, especially after that earlier declaration of war from Todoroki earlier." Another said, curiosity in their voice. "Declaration of war? I hadn't heard about that. Tell me all about it," the 1B extra exclaimed, but by that point, Bakugo wasn't listening, simply stalking away as he drew a few curious but otherwise uncaring glances. Izuku and Todoroki stared at each other for several minutes in a secluded corridor of the stadium, the area essentially abandoned as everyone enjoyed the stalls and other entertainment on offer elsewhere during the break. Todoroki was staring with his customary stoicism, but Izuku was experienced enough in reading people to recognize that he was both confused and annoyed. Izuku, for his part, was simply leaning against the wall, relaxed, as he observed the taller teen, waiting. Todoroki appeared to be trying to stare him down, but Izuku had been stared down by eminently more intimidating people, including extraplanar entities, demons, literal gods, and an angry Tasaka Rin backed up by an irritated Saber, a disappointed Sakura and an annoyed Ilya when he did something stupid. Compared to all of that, Todoroki didn't even qualify as a novice. "What did you want to talk about?" Todoroki finally asked, his patience eventually running out. Izuku shifted slightly, folding his arms across his chest as he looked the other teen in the eye. "I'm concerned about your reaction to using your fire in the cavalry battle," he said slowly, drawing on his many experiences dealing with recalcitrant teens, primarily from his life as Peter. Todoroki tensed. "That's none of your business," he grunted, turning to leave. "It has to do with All Might, doesn't it?" Izuku said in response before Todoroki could get far. "Him and someone else. Your father, perhaps." Todoroki whirled around, eyes a bit wide. "How?" What you said before the festival started. Izuku pointed out. You were especially focused on both my own strength and my relationship with All Might. You said that his attention on me added further motivation. That could simply mean that you consider someone that has his attention a bigger measuring stick, but then there was that hesitation when you said you needed to prove yourself. He paused for a moment, studying Todoroki, who was still staring at him with a bit of shock. I don't know much about you before you came to Ua, Todoroki-kun, but it's not that hard to guess that you meant your father. Your refusal to use your flames points to something related to that, and he's the most prominent fire user in your life you're likely to feel the need to prove something to. He's also been the number 2 hero behind All Might for decades, so it's not hard to believe your own focus on All Might was inherited from him, so to speak. Lastly, for as good as he can be at his job, Endeavor is famously gruff and antisocial, which is one of the main reasons he's never risen above All Might in the rankings. As much as I'd like to wish otherwise, there's no reason to believe he isn't similar in his home life, which could lead to some domestic issues. He paused again, letting everything he'd just said percolate through Todoroki's head, before speaking. So, Todoroki, what is it that Endeavor has done that's made you shun your fire? Todoroki simply stared for a bit longer, his left hand clenching into a fist before unclenching shortly afterwards. Eventually he sighed and walked back to where he'd been standing, seeming to gather his thoughts for a bit before speaking. What do you know about quirk marriages? As the entire sordid tale came out, Izuku's frown grew. As stated before, he was well acquainted with people having issues involving trauma, but that didn't mean it was ever any easier to listen to, especially to someone as currently empathetic as Izuku. Not only that, he could see plenty of reasons for his classmates' neurosis, but none was bigger than his last statement at the end of this tale. That is why I refuse to ever use that man's quirk, Todoroki said grimly, his face locked into a heavy scowl. There was silence for a few moments as Todoroki recovered from his small break in composure at telling Izuku the story while the Greenette himself considered how best to approach the issue. Before anything more could be said, however, Todoroki whirled around and began to walk away. I will defeat you in this tournament, Midoriya. Without my fire, he said simply as he left, and Izuku let him go, staring after him as ideas began to crystallize in his mind. Once Todoroki was gone he spoke. I trust you'll have the good grace to keep this between us, Bakugo. There was silence for a few moments before the sound of feet walking away from around the corner came. The hell do you take me for, Deku? Izuku let out a deep breath as he was left alone, bringing his fingers up to massage the bridge of his nose. Nothing could ever be simple, could it? Freaking super-powered teenagers. A hearty meal from Lunch Rush later found the teens back in the stadium as the crowds cheered, looking forward to the final event of the festival. Izuku was mainly lost in his thoughts over what to do about Todoroki's issues, though his attention was definitely drawn when the 1A girls came out in cheerleader uniforms. Even as he reminded himself to give Mineta and Kaminari a good talking to, he saved the very appealing image in his memory for posterity. What? Despite his memories, he was still a straight, hormonal teenager surrounded by very attractive young women. Sue him. Still, other than that brief distraction, he didn't really pay all that much attention to things around him till Uraraka nudged him and he saw they were about to draw lots for the tournament that would be capping off the festival. He shook his contemplation off and proceeded to draw his lot, curious as to who he'd end up facing, and once the brackets were done he studied them with interest. Match 1. Shinso Hitoshi vs Tokage Setsuna. Match 2. Todoroki Shoto vs Kendo Itsuka. Match 3. Iida Tenya vs Tsunotori Pony. Match 4. Hagakure Toru vs Midoriya Izuku. Match 5. Kirishima Eijiro vs Tetsu. Match 6. Asui Tsuyu vs Hatsume Mei. Match 7. Yaoyorozu Momo vs Shishida Jirota. Match 8. Uraraka Ochako vs Bakugo Katsuki. Quickly calculating the potential matchups, he saw that if he kept winning he'd eventually end up facing Todoroki in the semifinal and Bakugo in the final, assuming they won their matches as well. That gave him some time to figure things out in regards to Todoroki. Bakugo, well, he already had some ideas there, having had more time to mull over the problem. He really should have studied psychology more heavily in at least one of his previous lives. He had some hard-won experience, as stated before, but a better grounding in it would have helped. He added it to a to-do list he was constantly building up to as he took his seat in the competitors' stands, looking down to see Setsuna prepare to face off against the purple-haired boy from Gen Ed. Well, at least now he knew his name. Most of the audience wouldn't be able to hear what was being said down in the arena through the distance and the noise of the crowd, but Izuku had some advantages. He reinforced his ears and used some mental focus skills to isolate what he wanted to hear. It caused a brief moment of pain before his enhanced hearing was able to isolate the suddenly much more overwhelming noise, but he was able to make out what was said. Shinso said she shouldn't feel bad when she lost, and Tokage laughingly began to respond that she should be the one saying that before her face went slack. Izuku's eyebrows rose when Shinso simply told her to walk out of bounds, and she immediately turned and did so, much to the shock of Present Mike and the audience. While absently listening to Aizawa talk, complain about how the heroics entrance exam let people with quirks that didn't work directly against robots fall through the cracks, Izuku tapped his finger to his lips. That was definitely a powerful and useful quirk, almost no matter what you wanted to do with it. And he could see why the boys seemed so resentful of the heroic students, not only due to their position but also other likely previous experiences while growing up with such a quirk. Izuku definitely knew what quirk-based bullying was like in the society he currently lived in. Not only did he have his own experiences to draw on, there had been one or two students in Aldera that had been a bit bullied due to their quirks. They'd been fortunate enough that there was a much easier target around in the form of Izuku, though. At least they had quirks, after all. Though it seemed Shinso at least had some friends in Gen Ed, considering some kids had congratulated him for his win. And several pros in the stands were discussing among themselves how much they wished they had someone with such an ability in their own agencies. Geez, that's one scary quirk. Shiro commented as they watched Tokage leave the arena dejectedly. I definitely wouldn't want to face him in a fight. TCH. Bakugo grunted, annoyed. Only if you're a dumbass, flat face. He leaned back with his hands behind his head as he waited for the next match. Once you know the trick to it, it's easy to avoid. Just don't say jack shit. That's a good point, Yaoyorozu said thoughtfully. If Shinso-san wishes to be a pro hero, then he'd be best served by being an underground hero like Aizawa-sensei. It'd keep the villains from knowing too much about him. Hoo boy, there comes Todoroki. Sato said, changing the subject. He's fighting Kendo, right? Yep, there she comes, Kaminari said as he motioned to the Oranget, who was walking out onto the arena at the same time as Todoroki. Hope he doesn't hurt her too bad. He looks a bit pissed. Indeed, Todoroki's usually impassive face seemed more irritated than normal. Izuku wondered if this was related to their conversation, or if this was due to something else. As soon as midnight gave the signal to start, Izuku blinked in shock as Uraraka squeaked in surprise next to him at the massive glacier that had suddenly appeared to fill over half the stadium, covering the area above where 1A was pretty completely, making the sunlight refract through it and casting the stands in shade. Holy shit, Juro finally exclaimed, breaking the silence as she gawked. I keep almost forgetting how ridiculous Todoroki is, and then he does this. Mineta was shivering. Seriously, how is he so freaking strong? Izuku was distracted when his still reinforced ears caught the sound of Todoroki talking to Kendo once midnight called the match in his favor, apologizing and telling her he'd just been angry. As the boy began using his fire to melt Kendo out and the audience began to surprisingly comfort Kendo after the second curb stomp of the tournament in a row, Izuku's eyes narrowed as he wondered what, exactly, had caused Todoroki's ire to be roused. Was it just Izuku's prying into his past? Then he looked elsewhere in the stands and saw Endeavor looking down at the arena in displeasure, and he had a hunch. Still, he couldn't do anything about it at the moment, though he added it to his ideas for how to handle Todoroki. So instead he focused on talking to his classmates. Once the ice looked like it was close to being dealt with, Izuku got out of his seat. Come on, Hagakure-chan. We should get to the waiting rooms to get ready for our own match. Hagakure jerked in her seat. Ah, right. She got up and her clothes gave a shake as she apparently tried to relax. Just don't beat me too bad, okay? Izuku gave her a small smile. Now, no thinking like that. Just do your best. He patted her back as they left the stands to their classmates, wishing them good luck, more to Hagakure than him, which amused him slightly and made him smile wider as he led the girl downstairs. Ochako watched her friends leave the stands before turning back to the arena as the ice was finally dealt with and Iida and Pony walked out onto it. How do you think this will go, Yaomomo? She asked the other girl. The heiress hummed as she considered that. I have not seen Pony-chan use her quirk yet, but Iida is fast and smart. If he can reach her and force her out of bounds before she can react, it should be an easy win for him. Before any more could be said, Midnight began the match. Iida immediately dashed for Pony at the full speed he could reach in the space available, but the American girl suddenly whirled around and swung a hoofed foot in a roundhouse kick that would have taken Iida full in the face had the boy not immediately thrown himself into a slide, the foot barely brushing the top of his head. Pony was unprepared for the move and her other leg was taken out, making her drop to the ground with a cry, though she quickly put her hands out to catch herself, falling properly being one of the absolute first things Izuku taught his students. Iida's momentum carried him past her, enough so that he couldn't take immediate advantage of her momentary loss of balance, though he wasn't in danger of leaving the arena. No fool, he immediately dashed to the side, which was an excellent move considering Pony turned her fall into a flip, allowing her to launch her horns at him in moments while still falling onto her back. Had they hit, they would have had enough force to carry him the rest of the way out of bounds, but he wasn't there, having stopped at a corner to reorient. An amazing first exchange by both contestants. This is what I'm talking about. Present Mike screamed excitedly, much to Aizawa's annoyance. Iida immediately dashed back to her position, but Pony decided to stay laying on the ground, since it would make it harder for him to grab or push her while at speed. She turned her head to launch 2 more horns at Iida, the speedster dodging them as best he could considering the speed he was going at, though one grazed him and tore his uniform. He didn't realize that the first pair had come around from behind, however, still under Pony's control, and it was only him ducking down to try to grab at her that allowed him to accidentally avoid them, though he could feel the disturbed air from their passage, making his eyes widen in shock. Pony was in the process of trying to flip herself around while remaining on the ground to bring her feet around to bear for a kick, which at the speed he was going would be devastating if it connected, considering her leg strength, but Iida was just slightly faster and managed to grab hold of the front of her uniform. Both of the teens blushed heavily when Iida momentarily grabbed hold of one of her bodies while closing his hand on her shirt. It distracted Pony enough to give Iida, who managed to keep his head in the game despite his own embarrassment at his own actions, enough time to plant his foot and whirl around with all his engine-assisted might, managing to pick Pony up enough to send her flying towards the nearest area edge. Luckily for Iida, UA built their PE uniforms to endure, so it didn't rip despite all of Pony's weight being supported by his 2 handholds, allowing him to get her where he wanted. He released her while she was in mid-air and then, slightly dizzy but having trained for such maneuvers, immediately oriented himself into another dash, tackling her while she was still in the air and adding to her momentum. He immediately stopped himself upon impact, but the additional force was enough to add to Pony's flight, and before she could react she landed right outside the boundary line. Midnight immediately raised her whip. Iida is the winner. As the crowd immediately began to cheer for the much more satisfying match they'd just witnessed, Iida made his way over to Pony, immediately bowing to her at a 90-degree angle. I apologize profusely for my actions, accidental as they might have been. Pony got to her feet, rubbing the body he'd accidentally grabbed, as he obviously hadn't been gentle. I'm not happy about it, but it was an accident in a fight. She said with a sigh. Iida straightened up. I am immensely grateful for your understanding. He exclaimed. I do wonder how my friends will react when I tell them, though. Pony added with what could only be called innocent maliciousness, making Iida turn white as a sheet of paper as he began sweating profusely. Before he could respond, beg for mercy, Pony turned to leave the arena, making him follow suit even more stiffly than usual. Toru was doing her best to remain calm by using some breathing exercises as she waited to be called out to the arena for her fight against Midoriya-kun, trying not to freak out. She really didn't want to fight him. Not only was she keenly aware that she had absolutely no chance, but this was the boy that had gotten injured and been forced to kill an enemy to save her before focusing on patching her up instead of his own wounds. She was self-aware enough to know she was developing a crush on him after that, mixed with a healthy dose of hero worship. She really didn't want to fight him. Still, she was here as part of her path to being a hero, so she wasn't going to shrink back from that. Even if she got utterly obliterated in seconds, she was going to give it her all to show what she was made of. When Present Mike called out her introduction, she took one last deep breath before beginning to walk out onto the arena. She could see Midoriya-kun doing the same opposite her, his steps steady and show, confident but not arrogant, and her heart fluttered for multiple reasons. She was glad no one could see her hands shaking. One of the advantages of invisibility. Then Midoriya-kun smiled at her encouragingly as Midnight asked if they were ready, and she clenched her fists. This was it. To be continued. Please subscribe this channel for more interesting videos.